The champagne glass shattered against marble. Silence devoured the ballroom like a living thing. Adrianne Vale stood alone beneath the chandeliers, her crimson gown blazing against a sea of black tailcoats and pale faces. Before her, Duke Marcus Halbrook's eyes were winter itself, cold, ancient, merciless. "You possess neither restraint nor grace." His voice cut through the stillness. "A woman like you is not fit to be a wife." 300 aristocrats held their breath. This was the moment everything changed, when one woman's courage ignited a war against the most powerful man in Britain. Stay until the end to discover how a disgraced merchant's daughter became the woman who brought an empire to its knees. Like and comment which city you're watching from. The gas lamps of Hartwell Manor burned like fallen stars across the London night, casting their golden glow over carriages that lined the cobblestone drive for nearly half a mile. Inside the grand ballroom, crystal chandeliers dripped light onto silk gowns and diamond tiaras, onto starched collars and polished medals, onto the cream of British society gathered for the annual charity ball of 1857, that glittering facade where England's powerful pretended to care about England's poor. Adrianne Vale had known from the moment her mother laced her into the crimson evening gown that tonight would be different. The color alone was a rebellion. Unmarried women wore white or the palest pastels, never the deep scarlet that now clung to her figure like liquid fire. Her mother had protested, her father had frowned, but Adrianne had been adamant. If she was going to speak truth to power, she would not do it dressed like a virgin sacrifice. "You're being foolish," her younger sister Charlotte had whispered in the carriage. "Father's shipping contracts depend on maintaining good relations with the peerage. You know that." Adrianne had squeezed her sister's hand, but said nothing. How could she explain that some things mattered more than contracts? That she'd spent 3 sleepless nights reading the reports Nathan Calder had smuggled to her, accounts of men dying in mine collapses that could have been prevented, of children losing fingers in machinery that should never have been operated by small hands, of families evicted from estate cottages in the dead of winter because they'd complained about conditions? The ballroom swallowed them with its opulence. Marble columns soared toward frescoed ceilings where cherubs and clouds danced in painted perfection. The orchestra occupied a raised platform, their strings weaving melodies that seemed designed to make everyone forget there was a world beyond these walls where people suffered. Long tables displayed enough food to feed a dozen families for a month. Roasted pheasants with gold-leafed skin, towering cakes dripping with sugar and cream, pyramids of exotic fruits that had traveled farther than most Londoners would in their entire lives. The Vales! How delightful! Lady Pemberton swept toward them, her smile as calculated as her jewelry. "And Adrianne, dear, what an unusual choice of color! How very modern!" The emphasis on that last word carried volumes. Modern meant untraditional. Untraditional meant unsuitable. Unsuitable meant unmarriageable. Adrianne smiled back with equal calculation. "I thought it time we stopped pretending to be what we're not, Lady Pemberton. Pale colors wash me out terribly." Around them, conversations ebbed and flowed like tides. Talk of investments and marriages, of parliamentary votes and society scandals, of everything and nothing at all. Adrianne's father, Thomas Vale, was quickly absorbed into a circle of merchants and minor nobles, his booming laugh punctuating negotiations that would happen anywhere but here, in any form but this. Her mother drifted toward the matrons, already assessing which unmarried sons might be persuaded to overlook her daughter's spirited nature. Adrianne felt Charlotte's fingers tighten on her arm. There he is. She didn't need to ask who. Even in a room crowded with power and privilege, Duke Marcus Halbrook commanded attention like gravity commands falling objects. Inevitable, irresistible, absolute. He stood near the far windows, surrounded by a constellation of lesser lights, who orbited him with careful deference. At 32, Marcus Halbrook was everything the aristocracy believed itself to be. Tall and imposing, with the kind of classical features that belonged on Roman coins, dark hair swept back from a broad forehead, and eyes the color of slate in winter. He wore his evening clothes with the casual perfection of someone who'd never had to think about whether he belonged anywhere. Why would he? His family had owned half of northern England for 3 centuries. "They say he's worth over £1 million," Charlotte breathed. Can you imagine? £1,000,000. Adrianne could imagine it. She could imagine it very well. She could imagine how much of that fortune had been built on the broken backs of miners who earned barely enough to feed their families. How much came from textile mills where women worked 16-hour days in air so thick with cotton fibers they coughed blood? How much was stained with the suffering of people who would never set foot in a ballroom like this one? They also say he's never loved anything in his life except his horses and his reputation, Adrianne replied, and that he's looking for a wife this season. Every unmarried woman in London has been throwing herself at him for years, but Lady Thornfield says he's finally ready to settle down. Can you imagine being a duchess? Living in Halbrook Hall with its 70 rooms and those gardens that go on for miles. Charlotte's romantic fantasies dissolved into the music. Adrianne watched Marcus Halbrook laugh at something one of his companions said. A controlled laugh, measured and brief, that seemed more like a social obligation than genuine amusement. Everything about him was controlled, she realized. Every gesture calculated, every word chosen, every expression precisely calibrated to maintain the exact image he wanted to project. Miss Vale. She turned to find Nathan Calder at her elbow, his weathered face incongruous among the pampered aristocracy. At 45, Nathan was what the peerage called new money, an industrialist who'd built his fortune through intelligence and ruthlessness rather than inheritance. His steel mills produced some of the finest metal in Britain, and unlike most manufacturers, he believed that well-treated workers were more productive workers. Revolutionary thinking, that. Mr. Calder, I didn't expect to see you here. Lady Hartwell's charity ball welcomes anyone who can afford the donation. His smile was wry. Even those of us who actually work for our money. I received your note. You've read the reports? Every word, 3 times. And I want to vomit every time I think about it. Adrianne kept her voice low, aware of how sound carried in the cavernous room. Those mine collapses weren't accidents. The timbers were rotten, the ventilation systems hadn't been maintained in years, and the overseers knew. They knew, and they did nothing because replacing supports cost money. Nathan's expression darkened. 7 men died in that collapse. 7 men with families, with children, and the Duke's estate managers paid the widows £10 each and told them to be grateful. Does he know? The Duke, I mean. Does Marcus Halbrook know what's happening in his own mines? What do you think? Nathan's voice carried a bitter edge. Men like him don't dirty their hands with details. They hire managers to handle the unpleasant business of actually running their estates while they attend balls and hunt foxes and congratulate themselves on their benevolent stewardship of the lower classes. Adrianne's fingers tightened on her fan until the delicate ivory creaked. She could feel her heart beating faster, could feel the heat rising in her chest, that familiar sensation that her governess had always called your unfortunate tendency toward passion, Miss Adrianne. As if passion was something to be ashamed of. As if caring too much was a character flaw. Someone needs to tell him, she said quietly. Nathan looked at her sharply. Tell him. Adrianne, men like Marcus Halbrook don't want to be told anything, especially not by a woman? By a merchant's daughter who should be grateful to be admitted to the same room as her betters? I was going to say by anyone who threatens their comfortable illusions. The aristocracy has built an entire system designed to insulate them from the consequences of their actions. You think one conversation at a charity ball is going to penetrate that? Perhaps not, but silence certainly won't. Before Nathan could respond, a hush rippled through the ballroom. The orchestra had finished their piece, and Lord Hartwell was ascending to the small stage, his florid face beaming at his guests. The charity auction was about to begin, that annual ritual where the wealthy bid outrageous sums for donated items, pretending their extravagance was altruism rather than competition. My lords, ladies, and distinguished guests, Hartwell's voice boomed across the sudden silence. Welcome to the 23rd Annual Hartwell Charity Ball. Tonight, your generous contributions will aid the deserving poor of London, providing food, shelter, and moral instruction to those less fortunate than ourselves. Polite applause rippled through the crowd. Adrianne felt her jaw tighten. The deserving poor, as if poverty was something people earned through lack of virtue rather than lack of opportunity. The auction proceeded with predictable excess. A landscape painting by an Italian master went for 300 guineas. A set of Indian shawls fetched 200. A thoroughbred colt sparked a bidding war between two horse-mad nobles that ended at an eye-watering £500. Each purchase drew exclamations of admiration, as if spending money on luxuries somehow transmuted into genuine charity. "And now," Lord Hartwell announced, his smile widening, "a very special item. A collection of coal mining rights recently acquired by His Grace, the Duke of Halbrook, in the Northern Territories. All proceeds tonight will benefit the London Hospital for Poor Children." The crowd murmured appreciatively. Marcus Halbrook inclined his head in acknowledgement, accepting the praise with the same controlled grace he applied to everything. Something inside Adrianne snapped. Later, she wouldn't be able to say exactly what it was. The casual mention of mines where men had just died, the transformation of tragedy into charity spectacle, the Duke's serene expression as if everything in his world was perfectly ordered and morally justified. But in that moment, 3 years of careful social training, 22 years of being told to speak softly and never make scenes, everything her mother had drilled into her about appropriate behavior, all of it disintegrated like ash in a fire. She was moving before she consciously decided to move, her crimson gown cutting through the crowd like blood through water. People turned, surprised, as she passed. She heard her mother's shocked intake of breath, her father's warning, "Adrianne, no!" But it was too late. She was already there, already standing in front of Marcus Halbrook, already looking up into those winter-cold eyes. "Your Grace," her voice rang clear across the ballroom, cutting through the murmured conversations. "I wonder if you could tell us about the men who died in those northern mines 3 weeks ago, the ones whose deaths made this generous donation possible." The silence that followed was so complete she could hear the flames hissing in the gas lamps. Marcus Halbrook looked at her with the kind of attention one might give to a sudden, inexplicable phenomenon. Not hostile, not yet, but intensely focused. Up close, he was even more imposing than she'd expected, his presence carrying the weight of generations of unquestioned authority. "I'm afraid I don't take your meaning, Miss Vale, Adrianne Vale. And I think you take my meaning perfectly well, Your Grace. 7 men died in a mine collapse in Yorkshire last month. 7 men whose families now have no income, no support, and £10 in compensation for their dead husbands and fathers. Those were your mines, your responsibility." The crowd had drawn back slightly, creating a circle around them, the same instinctive human reaction that forms around street fights or public humiliations. Adrianne could feel 300 pairs of eyes on her, could sense the shock radiating through the room like ripples from a stone thrown in still water. Marcus's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes, a sharpening, a recalibration of threat assessment. "Mining is dangerous work," he said, his voice perfectly modulated, each word precisely placed. "Accidents happen despite all reasonable precautions. The families were compensated according to standard practice." "Standard practice?" Adrianne's voice rose despite her efforts to control it. "Is it standard practice to use rotten timber supports, to ignore ventilation requirements, to push men to work longer hours in increasingly unsafe conditions because it's cheaper than proper maintenance? You seem remarkably well informed about mining operations for a young lady." The temperature in his voice had dropped several degrees. "Might I ask where you acquired such specialized knowledge?" "From the reports your own overseers filed and then buried. From testimony of workers who've been told to stay silent or lose their positions. From doctors who've treated the injuries and illnesses your estate managers claim are the workers' own fault." A woman gasped somewhere to Adrianne's left. This wasn't how things were done. One didn't accuse a duke of negligence at a charity ball. One didn't accuse a duke of anything, anywhere, ever. The social order depended on maintaining certain fictions, and one of the most important was that the aristocracy deserved its position because it exercised responsible stewardship of its inferiors. "Those are serious allegations, Miss Vale." Marcus's voice could have frozen fire. "Allegations made without proof, in front of witnesses regarding matters you cannot possibly understand with any depth or accuracy. I understand that 7 men are dead. I understand that their families are destitute. I understand that you're auctioning mining rights for charity, while the mines themselves are maintained so poorly that workers call them death traps. You understand nothing." The words came out clipped, sharp as blade strikes. You stand here in your fashionable gown at a ball your family's merchant wealth barely qualifies you to attend, and you presume to lecture me about responsibility? About understanding the complexities of managing thousands of workers across dozens of enterprises. You have no concept of what's actually involved in running estates that employ entire towns, that feed and house and provide livelihoods for thousands of families. I understand that people are dying in your minds. People die everywhere, Miss Vale, in factories, in fields, in their own homes. Life is hard and uncertain for the working classes. That's the nature of their station. We who bear the burden of leadership do what we can to ameliorate their suffering, but we cannot prevent every tragedy, no matter how much romantic idealists might wish otherwise. The crowd was utterly silent now, transfixed. This was better than theater, more shocking than scandal. A nobody merchant's daughter publicly challenging a duke, and he was actually engaging with her rather than simply walking away. It was unprecedented. It was horrifying. It was absolutely riveting. Adrianne felt something hot and sharp building in her chest, felt her hands trembling with fury and frustration. He was so certain, so absolutely convinced of his own righteousness. He genuinely believed that his wealth and position gave him not just power but understanding, that because he'd been born into privilege, he somehow automatically possessed the wisdom to wield it justly. The nature of their station, she repeated, her voice shaking now. You mean the station you and men like you have assigned them? The poverty you maintain through low wages and dangerous conditions? The suffering you could prevent but choose not to because it's more profitable to let them die? Marcus Halbrook's eyes were now genuinely cold, his perfect aristocratic composure hardening into something glacial and absolute. When he spoke again, his voice carried through the ballroom with the finality of a judge pronouncing sentence. You possess neither restraint nor grace, Miss Vale. You know nothing of duty, nothing of genuine responsibility, nothing of the delicate balance required to maintain a functioning society. You are a child playing at politics, a romantic fool who thinks passion substitutes for wisdom. He paused, and in that pause Adrianne knew what was coming, knew it with the same certainty she knew the sun would rise. A woman like you is not fit to be a wife. The words detonated through the ballroom like artillery shells. Not fit to be a wife. In 1857, there were few greater insults to an unmarried woman of marriageable age. It was a public declaration of unworthiness, a pronouncement that struck at the very heart of what society expected women to be: compliant, gentle, supportive, silent. Adrianne felt the floor tilt beneath her, felt the eyes of every person in that ballroom boring into her like physical pressure. She heard her mother's muffled cry, saw her father's face go white with shock and fury. This was ruin. This was social death. Every woman present now knew that Duke Marcus Halbrook, one of the most eligible and influential men in Britain, had publicly declared her unfit for marriage. Every man present now knew that associating with her meant risking the Duke's displeasure. Her family's business, their social standing, everything they'd built, all of it had just been poisoned by 6 words. She should apologize. She should retreat, cry, beg forgiveness. She should do what women were expected to do when powerful men put them in their place. Instead, Adrianne Vale smiled. It wasn't a nice smile. It wasn't conciliatory or apologetic or in any way designed to smooth over the situation. It was the smile of someone who'd just realized they had nothing left to lose, and that sometimes having nothing to lose meant having everything to say. You're right, Your Grace, she said, her voice carrying clearly through the awful silence. I am not fit to be the wife of a man who values his reputation more than human lives. I am not fit to stand beside someone who considers preventable deaths an acceptable cost of maintaining his fortune. I am not fit to join a system that protects power at the expense of justice. Thank you for making that absolutely clear. She turned, a sharp, deliberate movement that sent her crimson skirt swirling, and walked toward the ballroom doors. The crowd parted before her like the Red Sea before Moses, every face a mask of shock or disapproval, or on a few younger faces, something that might have been reluctant admiration. Behind her she heard the whispers beginning, that rustling murmur of scandal being born. She heard her mother weeping, heard her father's low, furious tones as he began making apologies. She heard the orchestra stuttering back to life, trying desperately to restore normalcy to a situation that had just become irrevocably abnormal. She didn't look back. Not at Marcus Halbrook, not at the glittering society she was leaving in ruins, not at the life she'd just destroyed with 6 minutes of honest speech. Charlotte caught up with her in the entrance hall, her face pale and frightened. "Adrianne, what have you done? What have you done?" "What I had to," Adrianne replied. Her hands were shaking now, reaction setting in, but her voice remained steady. "What someone had to. But father's business, the contracts, your reputation, some things matter more than contracts and reputations." "Not in this world," Charlotte whispered. "Not in this world they don't." Their carriage arrived, called early, their departure now a necessity rather than a choice. Their parents emerged minutes later, Thomas Vale's face a thundercloud, their mother dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. The ride home passed in crushing silence, broken only by Mrs. Vale's occasional sobs. Adrianne stared out the window at London passing by, the great houses with their blazing windows, the darker streets beyond where the working poor huddled in tenements, the whole vast machinery of a society built on the principle that some people mattered more than others. She'd struck a blow against that tonight, she knew. A small blow, probably a futile blow, but a blow nonetheless. She didn't sleep that night. She lay in her bed, still wearing her crimson gown, and waited for dawn. The consequences began arriving with the Morning Post. The first was a tersely worded note from Lord Pembridge, terminating a shipping contract with her father's company. No explanation offered, none needed. The message was clear. Distance yourself from the Duke's displeasure or share in it. The second was a cancellation from the Ashworth Society, disinviting Adrianne from their annual garden party. Due to unforeseen circumstances, the third, fourth, and fifth were similar, invitations withdrawn, associations severed, doors closing with the soft finality of coffin lids. By noon, her mother had stopped opening the letters and simply stared at them piling up on the hall table like evidence of murder. 22 years, Mrs. Vale said numbly. 22 years I've spent building connections, maintaining friendships, positioning this family in society, and you destroyed it all in one night. One night, Adrianne. How could you? Mother, no. Her mother's voice cracked. You don't get to explain. You don't get to justify. You stood in front of 300 witnesses and publicly humiliated the Duke of Halbrook. The Duke of Halbrook, Adrianne, do you understand what that means? Do you comprehend what you've done to this family? Her father emerged from his study, his face aged 10 years overnight. The bank has called in our loans. Apparently they're reassessing our creditworthiness. Lord Thornfield just sent word that his investment in our Portuguese shipping venture is withdrawn. We're looking at potential ruin, Adrianne, complete ruin, because you couldn't control your tongue for one evening. Those men didn't die because I couldn't control my tongue, Adrianne shot back. They died because nobody else would speak up. And speaking up has accomplished what exactly? Her father's voice was bitter. Have those widows gotten more compensation? Have the mines been made safer? Have any conditions improved at all? Or have you simply martyred yourself and dragged your family down with you for absolutely nothing? The words hit like physical blows because they contained a grain of terrible truth. What had she actually accomplished? The Duke would continue running his estates exactly as before. The miners would still work in dangerous conditions. The system that crushed people beneath the wheels of profit and privilege would grind on unchanged. She'd made noise, caused scandal, and destroyed her family's position. For what? Your sister Charlotte will never make a good match now, her mother added, her voice hollow. Not with this scandal attached to our name. Your father's business may collapse entirely. We could lose everything. Was it worth it, Adrianne? Was your moment of self-righteous fury worth destroying everything your family has built? Adrianne had no answer. Or rather, she had an answer, but it was one her family couldn't accept. Yes. Yes, it was worth it. Even if it accomplished nothing, even if it was futile, even if it destroyed her, speaking truth to power was worth it. Because the alternative was complicity through silence. But she couldn't say that. Not to her mother's tear-stained face, not to her father's defeated expression, not to Charlotte's accusing eyes. The decision was made that afternoon. Adrianne would go to Bath. Your Aunt Catherine lives quietly there, her father explained, his tone businesslike now as if discussing a shipping route rather than his daughter's exile. She's respectable, well-connected enough, but far from London society. You'll stay with her until this scandal dies down. If we're fortunate, and if you conduct yourself with appropriate humility and discretion, perhaps in a year or two we can begin rebuilding what you've destroyed. Perhaps. You're sending me away. It wasn't a question. We're removing you from a situation where your presence causes continued damage, her mother corrected, but her voice was gentler now, exhausted. Bath is lovely, quiet. You'll have time to reflect, to understand the consequences of impulsive behavior. To be silenced, Adrianne thought, to be hidden away like a shameful secret until London forgot about the merchant's daughter who dared to challenge a duke. She left 3 days later on a cold morning when fog rolled off the Thames like smoke. Charlotte hugged her tightly at the door, whispering, "I understand why you did it. I do, but I wish the world was different." "So do I," Adrianne whispered back. "So do I." The journey to Bath took 2 days by coach, 2 days of rattling wheels and roadside inns and slowly increasing distance from everything she'd known. She watched London disappear in the carriage window, watched the countryside roll past, fields and villages, and lives lived far from the glittering ballrooms where reputations were made and destroyed. She thought about Marcus Halbrook, about those cold eyes and controlled voice and absolute certainty. She wondered if he'd given her a second thought after she'd walked away, or if she'd simply been filed away as a minor disturbance, an irritating footnote to an otherwise successful evening. She thought about the miners' widows receiving their £10 and being told to be grateful. She thought about men working in mines held up by rotten timber, living each day knowing the ceiling might collapse and their families would be left destitute. And she thought about Nathan Calder's question, "You think one conversation at a charity ball is going to penetrate that?" No, she thought as the coach rolled westward, one conversation won't. But perhaps it's a beginning. Perhaps someone else heard. Perhaps somewhere in some drawing room or club or newspaper office, someone is talking about what I said. Perhaps the spark hasn't died. It was a small hope, barely a flicker. But it was hope nonetheless. Bath emerged from the late afternoon mist like a city carved from honey-colored dreams. Perched along the River Avon, its Georgian architecture glowed in the waning light, elegant crescents and graceful terraces, the great Roman baths that had given the city its name, and everywhere a sense of ordered beauty, of civilization tamed and perfected. Aunt Catherine's house stood in the Royal Crescent, a testament to her late husband's naval success. She met Adrianne at the door, a tall, thin woman with iron-gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. "So you're the niece who set London ablaze," she said, looking Adrianne up and down. "Come in, girl. You look exhausted, and no wonder. Taking on the Duke of Halbrook isn't for the faint of heart." Adrianne blinked, surprised. She'd expected censure, lectures about proper behavior and knowing one's place. "You've heard about it, then?" "My dear child, all of England has heard about it. The newspapers are having a wonderful time. Half call you a dangerous radical, the other half a foolish girl who doesn't know her place. Both agree you've committed social suicide." Aunt Catherine smiled, and it was sharp as broken glass. "I think it's the most interesting thing to happen in years. Now come in and have tea. We have much to discuss." That evening, sitting in Aunt Catherine's drawing room with its view over the Crescent's manicured gardens, Adrianne learned that exile might not be the punishment she'd expected. "You think you've been defeated," her aunt said, pouring tea with practiced precision. "You think you made your stand, lost everything, and that's the end of the story. But you're wrong. What you did in that ballroom, that was just the beginning." "The beginning of what? My family's ruin? My sister's damaged prospects?" "The beginning of something necessary." Aunt Catherine fixed her with those penetrating eyes. "Power doesn't change because it wants to, Adrianne. It changes because it has to. Because people like you refuse to stay silent. Because sparks like the one you struck sometimes catch fire in unexpected places." "I don't understand." "You will," her aunt replied. "Bath isn't London, thank heavens. The society here is different, quieter, yes, but also more tolerant of eccentricity. And you, my dear niece, are about to become very eccentric indeed." Outside, the Bath evening descended in shades of amber and gold.
Somewhere in London, Duke Marcus Halbrook was probably dining in his mansion, his life continuing unchanged and unchallenged. Somewhere in Yorkshire, miners were descending into dangerous depths, their lives measured in the time it took for rotten timber to finally give way.
And here in Bath, a disgraced merchant's daughter sat with her aunt and realized that perhaps, just perhaps, her story wasn't over yet. The spark she'd struck in that London ballroom was still smoldering, and sometimes smoldering sparks were the most dangerous kind. Bath revealed itself slowly, like a secret being whispered rather than shouted. Unlike London with its aggressive grandeur and constant roar, this city moved to a gentler rhythm. Morning promenades along the River Avon, afternoon teas in elegant drawing rooms, evening concerts in the assembly rooms where conversation mattered more than spectacle. It was a place where scandals came to fade, where disgraced politicians and fallen socialites could rebuild their reputations through careful respectability and strategic amnesia. Adrianne hated every peaceful minute of it. 2 weeks after her arrival, she stood at her aunt's window watching rain streak the glass, feeling like a blade being deliberately dulled. Back in London, her father's letters reported mounting financial pressures. 2 more contracts canceled, creditors growing nervous. Whispers that the Vale shipping company might not survive the year. Charlotte wrote less frequently now, her letters brief and carefully neutral, as if even written words might carry the contamination of association. "You're brooding again," Aunt Catherine observed from her chair by the fire. She was working on needlepoint, an absurdly domestic occupation for a woman who'd once sailed with her husband to India and back, who'd negotiated with merchants in Calcutta and survived a typhoon off Madagascar. "It's becoming a habit." "I ruined them," Adrianne said without turning from the window. "Everything Father built, everything Mother worked for. I destroyed it all for a speech that changed nothing." "Changed nothing?" Catherine's needle paused. "My dear girl, you set London society talking about working conditions for the first time in decades. You made Duke Halbrook respond publicly to accusations of negligence. You demonstrated that the aristocracy isn't untouchable. That's not nothing. It's not enough either. Those miners are still dead. Their families are still destitute. And meanwhile, I'm here in Bath, safely exiled where I can't cause any more embarrassment. Then perhaps it's time to cause a different kind of embarrassment." Adrianne finally turned from the window. Her aunt had set down the needlepoint and was watching her with that penetrating gaze that seemed to see through walls and pretense alike. "What do you mean?" "I mean there's a gentleman arriving this afternoon specifically to meet you, Mr. Nathan Calder. I believe you're acquainted?" Adrianne's heart kicked against her ribs. "Nathan is coming here? Why?" "Because unlike most men, he doesn't believe exile should mean silence. And because he has a proposition that might interest you, assuming you haven't completely surrendered to comfortable defeat." The words stung precisely because they were accurate. Adrianne had been surrendering, slowly, to the weight of guilt and failure. It was easier than fighting, safer than hoping. "I haven't surrendered," she said quietly. "Good. Then go change into something less suited to mourning. Mr. Calder arrives at 3. Nathan Calder looked older than Adrianne remembered, the lines around his eyes deeper, his weathered face more careworn, but his handshake was firm and his gaze direct as Catherine showed him into the drawing room, then tactfully excused herself to attend to correspondence. "Miss Vale," Nathan said, settling into the chair across from her, "you've caused quite the uproar." "So I'm told, though from here in Bath it feels more like I've been efficiently silenced. That's what makes this the perfect time." Nathan leaned forward, his voice dropping though they were alone. "London society is still reeling from your accusations. The newspapers are still printing letters debating working conditions. Duke Halbrook's reputation has taken its first real blow in decades. Not fatal, not yet, but noticeable. People are asking questions they never asked before." "Questions that won't lead anywhere without proof," Adrianne replied. "I accused him of negligence based on reports and testimony, but nothing that could stand up in court or parliament. Nothing definitive." "Exactly. Which is why we need to get that proof." Nathan pulled a leather portfolio from his satchel and opened it on the table between them. "I've been conducting my own investigation into the Duke's northern estates, quietly, carefully, through contacts in the mining communities, and what I found is worse than we suspected. The documents he spread before her were damning, Detailed accounts of safety violations, records of complaints filed and ignored, testimony from workers too afraid to speak publicly but willing to talk to Nathan's investigators. There were sketches of mine tunnels held up by timber so rotten it crumbled to the touch. Calculations showing that proper maintenance would have cost the Duke perhaps 5% of his mining profits. Letters from estate managers explicitly recommending against safety improvements because the current system remains adequately profitable. "This is evidence," Adrianne breathed, her fingers trembling as she touched the papers. "Real evidence of systematic negligence. It's more than that. It's a pattern extending across multiple estates, multiple industries. The mines are just the most visible problem. His textile mills have similar issues: inadequate ventilation, dangerous machinery, workers pushed beyond human endurance. His tenant farms charge rent so high that families can barely afford food after paying them. The Duke of Halbrook has built his fortune on a foundation of human suffering, and he's done it knowingly, deliberately, because it's profitable." Adrianne looked up from the documents, her mind racing. "Why are you showing me this? Why not take it to Parliament yourself, or to the newspapers?" Nathan's expression turned grim. "Because I'm an industrialist, Miss Vale. A factory owner. If I start crusading against poor working conditions, every voice will accuse me of hypocrisy or settling business scores. They'll say I'm trying to damage a competitor or distract from problems in my own enterprises. Coming from me, these accusations would be dismissed as commerce dressed up as morality. But coming from me, coming from you, they're the continuation of what you started at that ball. You've already established yourself as someone willing to speak uncomfortable truths regardless of consequences. You have credibility born from sacrifice. You've already paid the social cost that most people fear." Nathan paused, his voice gentling. "I know what I'm asking, Adrianne. I'm asking you to step back into the fire, to risk whatever reputation you might still rebuild here in Bath. But if we're going to force change, if we're going to make those deaths matter, we need your voice." The rain drummed against the windows. Adrianne could feel her pulse beating in her throat, could feel the weight of the decision pressing down like a physical thing. She could stay in Bath, live quietly, let time slowly heal the wounds she'd inflicted on her family's prospects. In a year, perhaps two, the scandal might fade enough that Charlotte could still make a decent match, that her father could rebuild his business connections. Or she could do what Nathan was suggesting, turn her disgrace into a platform, transform scandal into weapon, and strike at the very heart of aristocratic power. "What exactly are you proposing?" she asked. Nathan smiled, and it wasn't a nice expression. "I'm proposing we turn your exile into a movement. Bath isn't London, but it's still a city with newspapers, with assembly rooms, with people who gather and talk. We publish these findings, hold public meetings, build pressure that London can't ignore. We force the Duke to respond, force Parliament to investigate, force society to confront what it's been conveniently ignoring. That could destroy what's left of my family's position entirely." "Yes," Nathan agreed bluntly. "It could. This isn't a safe choice, Adrianne. It's not even a smart choice by most measures. But it's a necessary choice. Someone has to stand against this. Someone has to say that human lives matter more than profits and aristocratic privilege." Adrianne closed her eyes, seeing in her mind the faces she'd never met, miners descending into darkness, children working machinery that could tear them apart, families huddling in freezing cottages because speaking up meant eviction. 7 men dead in a mine collapse. How many more would die while she stayed silent to protect her family's social standing? "My father will never forgive me," she said quietly. "Probably not. My mother will be devastated. Almost certainly. Charlotte's prospects will be ruined beyond any hope of recovery. Yes." Adrianne opened her eyes and met Nathan's gaze. "When do we start?" They began carefully, strategically, like generals planning a campaign against a vastly superior force. Nathan had connections in Bath's small but growing reform community, doctors concerned about working conditions, clergy troubled by the suffering they witnessed, businessmen who believed treating workers decently was both moral and practical. Within a week, Adrianne found herself at the center of an unlikely coalition meeting in the back room of a modest bookshop on Milsom Street. "The Duke will retaliate," Dr. William Morrison warned. He was a physician who'd treated injuries from factory accidents,
a slight man with intense eyes and gentle hands. The moment you publish anything connecting him to these conditions, he'll bring the full weight of his influence against you. He's already done that, Adrianne replied. I have nothing left to lose. Your family does, a voice spoke from the doorway. Adrianne turned to see a woman entering, elegant despite her simple dress, her dark hair streaked with gray. She moved with the confidence of someone accustomed to respect, and when she spoke again, her voice carried an educated accent that marked her as gentry, despite the lack of obvious wealth. Mrs. Helena Ashford, Aunt Catherine performed the introduction, widow of Colonel Ashford, and one of Bath's more progressive thinkers. Progressive is generous, Helena said with a slight smile. I prefer realistic. And realistically, Miss Vale, your family will suffer tremendously if you pursue this course.
Your father's business could collapse completely. Your sister's marriage prospects are already damaged. This would eliminate them entirely. Your mother's social position would become untenable. Is your conscience worth that price? The question hung in the air like an accusation. Adrianne felt her hands clench in her lap, felt the familiar guilt twisting in her stomach. I don't know, she admitted finally. I genuinely don't know if I have the right to make that decision for them. But I also don't know if I can stay silent knowing what I know, having seen what I've seen. Helena studied her for a long moment, then nodded. Good. That doubt is what makes you trustworthy. People who are absolutely certain of their righteousness tend to become tyrants. She settled into a chair, her expression sharpening. Very well. If we're going to do this, we do it intelligently. Emotion won't win this fight. Evidence will. Strategy will. Patience will. Over the following weeks, they built their case with painstaking care. Nathan's investigators gathered more testimony, documented more violations, built an irrefutable record of negligence spanning years and multiple estates. Dr. Morrison contributed medical records showing patterns of preventable injuries and illnesses. Helena used her connections to gather information about which members of Parliament might be sympathetic, which newspapers might publish their findings, which public figures could be recruited as allies. Adrianne wrote, she spent hours at her aunt's desk, transforming raw data and testimony into clear, compelling arguments. She learned to support every claim with evidence, to anticipate objections, to write not with passion alone but with the cold logic that might persuade skeptics. She drafted articles, composed speeches, prepared documents that could withstand the inevitable attacks. You're becoming dangerous, Aunt Catherine observed one evening, reading over Adrianne's latest draft. Not the impulsive danger you showed at that ball, but something more calculated, more effective. Is that a compliment? It's an observation and a warning. Marcus Halbrook didn't reach his position by being careless. When he realizes what you're building here, he won't simply dismiss you as a hysterical girl anymore. He'll treat you as a genuine threat. Good, Adrianne replied, though her hands shook slightly as she wrote. Let him. The first article appeared in the Bath Chronicle on a Tuesday morning in early spring. Written under a pseudonym but clearly connected to the ballroom scandal, it detailed safety conditions in northern coal mines with devastating precision. Names were named, dates were given, evidence was cited. The piece concluded with a direct question. If Duke Marcus Halbrook possesses the wealth to maintain his London mansion and his extensive art collection, can he not also afford to maintain mine supports that won't collapse and kill his workers? The response was immediate and explosive. London newspapers picked up the story within days. Some dismissed it as vindictive scandal-mongering from a disgraced woman seeking revenge. Others found the evidence troubling enough to demand investigation. Workers' groups began organizing, calling for Parliament to examine conditions in aristocratic estates. Reform-minded clergy preached sermons about moral responsibility and Christian duty to the poor. And in his London mansion, Duke Marcus Halbrook finally took notice of the merchant's daughter he'd dismissed as a romantic fool. The letter arrived on a Thursday, delivered by special courier to Aunt Catherine's door. It was brief, written in a controlled hand that matched its author's personality perfectly. Miss Vale, your campaign of public defamation has not gone unnoticed. I propose we discuss this matter in person, as adults rather than through inflammatory journalism. I will be visiting Bath next week to inspect properties in the area. I trust you can spare an afternoon for civilized conversation. I expect your attendance at the Royal Crescent Hotel Monday at 3 o'clock. Marcus Halbrook. It's a trap, Nathan said flatly when Adrianne showed him the letter. They were in the bookshop's back room, the latest editions of their publication spread across the table. He wants to intimidate you face to face, remind you of the power differential, convince you to stop before you do more damage to his reputation. Or perhaps he wants to actually talk, Helena suggested thoughtfully. The man's not stupid. He knows these articles are gaining traction. If he can't silence you through social pressure, he might try negotiation. Either way, I have to go, Adrianne said. Refusing would look like cowardice, and honestly, she paused, choosing her words carefully. I want to hear what he has to say. I want to know if any part of him actually cares about the suffering his estates cause, or if it's all just profit calculations and aristocratic pride. Monday arrived wrapped in unseasonable warmth, spring sunshine flooding Bath's honey-colored stone. Adrianne dressed carefully in a walking dress of deep green, respectable, dignified, nothing that could be called inflammatory or inappropriate. She plaited her hair severely, wore no jewelry beyond her mother's simple locket. She was armoring herself not with defiance, but with propriety, demonstrating that she could be everything society expected while still refusing to be silent. The Royal Crescent Hotel occupied one of Bath's most prestigious addresses. Adrianne walked there alone despite Aunt Catherine's protests, her heart beating faster with each step. She'd spent weeks preparing for this conversation in her mind, rehearsing arguments, steeling herself against intimidation. Nothing prepared her for the reality of Marcus Halbrook standing when she entered the private dining room, his gray eyes meeting hers with an expression she couldn't quite read. Miss Vale, thank you for coming. His voice was controlled as always, but something was different, a tension in his shoulders, a tightness around his eyes that suggested sleepless nights. Please, sit. She sat, keeping her spine straight, her hands folded in her lap. Your letter was not exactly a request, Your Grace. No, he agreed, settling across from her. A tea service sat between them, untouched. I've learned that indirect approaches don't work well with you. You prefer plain speech. I prefer honesty. Then let me be honest. Marcus leaned forward slightly, his gaze intense. After that disaster at the Hartwell Ball, I did something I rarely do. I investigated personally rather than trusting my estate manager's reports. I went to Yorkshire. I inspected the mines where those men died. And what I found, he paused, and for the first time since she'd met him, his perfect aristocratic composure cracked slightly. What I found was unconscionable. Adrianne felt her breath catch. You're saying the accusations were true? They were worse than true. They were systematic. His jaw tightened. The mine supports hadn't been properly maintained in over 3 years. Ventilation systems were broken or bypassed to save costs. Workers who complained were threatened with dismissal, which in those communities means destitution because the mine is the only employment for miles. My estate managers knew about all of it. They knew, and they did nothing because proper maintenance would have reduced profits by 4%. 4%, Miss Vale. 7 men died, so my estates could be 4% more profitable. The admission hung between them like something physical and heavy. Adrianne stared at him, searching for deception, for aristocratic manipulation, for anything except what seemed like genuine horror. Why are you telling me this? She asked finally. Because you were right. The words came out harsh, forced, as if each one cost him something. You stood in that ballroom and called me negligent, and I responded with contempt because I genuinely believed you were a naive fool playing at politics. I believed my estate managers when they assured me everything was properly maintained. I believed the system worked because believing otherwise would mean confronting uncomfortable truths about how my fortune is actually generated. He paused, his voice dropping. I've spent the last 6 weeks confronting those truths. They're as ugly as you suggested. Adrianne felt the world tilting beneath her. This wasn't what she had expected. Not admission, not something that sounded almost like apology. What do you intend to do about it? I've already begun. New mine supports throughout the Yorkshire properties, ventilation systems repaired or replaced, safety inspections conducted by independent engineers rather than estate managers with profit incentives. 3 of my senior overseers have been dismissed. The families of the men who died are receiving proper compensation, not £10, but enough to live on for at least 2 years while they rebuild their lives. That's, Adrianne struggled for words, that's more than I expected. It's less than they deserve. Marcus's voice was bitter now, self-directed. But it's a beginning. I'm implementing similar reforms across all my holdings, mines, mills, tenant farms. It will cost a fortune, and my peers think I've lost my mind, but I've discovered something interesting, Miss Vale. I find I care less about their opinions than I once did. He pulled papers from a leather case and slid them across the table. Adrianne picked them up with trembling hands. Official documents detailing safety improvements, compensation agreements, new operating procedures. Everything he'd claimed, documented, and signed. "Why are you showing me this?" she asked. "If you're truly reforming your estates, why do you need me to know?" "Because the reforms aren't enough." Marcus met her gaze directly. "I can fix my own properties, but that doesn't change the system. It doesn't help workers on other estates, in other industries, under other owners who won't investigate their own operations. You were right about more than just my negligence, Miss Vale. You were right that the entire structure is built to prioritize aristocratic profit over human welfare. One reformed duke doesn't change that." "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting an alliance." Marcus's voice was measured now, careful. "You have credibility with reform groups, with newspapers willing to publish exposés, with people who will never trust aristocratic motivations. I have access to information about other estates, connections in parliament, resources to support investigations. Together, we could accomplish what neither of us could alone." Adrianne's mind raced. An alliance with Marcus Halbrook, the man who'd publicly declared her unfit to be a wife, who'd triggered her exile, whose name was synonymous with aristocratic power and privilege. It was impossible. It was politically brilliant. It was exactly the kind of unlikely partnership that might actually work. "I don't trust you," she said bluntly. "I wouldn't trust me either," Marcus replied. "I'm proposing we work together despite that lack of trust. Mutual suspicion might actually keep us both honest. And when our goals diverge, when reforming your reputation conflicts with genuinely helping workers, then we fight about it like adults instead of destroying each other publicly like children." He paused, something almost like respect crossing his features. "You've proven you're willing to sacrifice everything for your principles, Miss Vale. I'm trying to prove I can learn from my mistakes. Maybe that's enough foundation to build on." A knock at the door interrupted them. A hotel servant entered, his face pale and urgent. "Your Grace, I apologize for the intrusion, but there's news from London. A fire at one of your textile mills. It's bad, sir." Marcus stood so quickly his chair scraped across the floor. "How bad?" "At least 20 injured, maybe more. The mill foreman sent urgent word. They're requesting your immediate presence." Every trace of color drained from Marcus's face. Adrianne watched as aristocratic composure shattered completely, revealing raw fear beneath. "The new safety protocols, were they implemented?" "I don't know, sir. The message only mentioned the fire and casualties." Marcus was moving before the servant finished speaking, grabbing his coat, his mind clearly racing through logistics. Then he stopped, turned back to Adrianne with an expression of desperate calculation. "Come with me," he said abruptly. Adrianne blinked. "What?" "Come with me to London. If my reforms failed, if workers were injured because I didn't implement changes quickly enough or thoroughly enough, then you deserve to witness that failure. And if—" He paused, something raw showing in his eyes. "If people are hurt and need help, I suspect you're better equipped to provide it than I am." It was insane. Traveling to London with Duke Marcus Halbrook, rushing to a disaster at one of his properties, inserting herself into a crisis that would be crawling with aristocrats and estate managers and probably hostile workers who'd see her as another useless noble playing at charity. "Yes," Adrianne heard herself say. "Yes, I'll come." They left within the hour. Marcus's carriage was fast, well-sprung, built for speed rather than comfort. As Bath's honey-colored stone gave way to countryside rushing past, as the horses pounded northward toward London and smoke and crisis, Adrianne sat across from the Duke, who'd once called her unfit to be a wife, and realized that everything had just changed again. The war wasn't over. It had just acquired an unexpected dimension, a complexity she hadn't anticipated. Marcus Halbrook was either genuinely trying to change, or he was the most sophisticated manipulator she'd ever encountered. She'd find out which at a burning mill, surrounded by injured workers and the wreckage of industrial catastrophe. The countryside blurred past. Marcus stared out the window, his jaw tight, his hands clenched. And Adrianne felt her heart racing with a mixture of fear and something else. Something that felt dangerously like hope, that perhaps, just perhaps, speaking truth to power hadn't been futile after all. The smoke was visible 5 miles before they reached the mill, a dark column rising against the afternoon sky like a funeral pyre. The smoke thickened as they approached, turning the afternoon sun into a sickly orange disk that barely penetrated the haze. Marcus leaned out the carriage window, his face pale and set, watching the black column grow larger with each passing mile. Adrianne could see his hands gripping the window frame so tightly his knuckles had gone white. "How many workers in that mill?" she asked quietly. 237. Mostly women and children on the spinning floors, men in the weaving rooms. His voice was hollow. "I implemented new fire protocols 3 weeks ago. Wider aisles, additional exits, water barrels on every floor. If they weren't followed, if someone decided those safety measures interfered with productivity." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The mill came into view around a bend in the road, and Adrianne felt her stomach clench. It was a massive brick structure, 4 stories tall, with rows of windows that had once admitted light, but now belched smoke like the mouths of dragons. Flames licked from the upper floors, orange and vicious, while below, a chaotic mass of people swarmed the yard, workers stumbling from the building, others trying to organize bucket brigades, still others simply standing in shock, their faces streaked with soot and tears. Marcus was out of the carriage before it fully stopped, running toward the chaos with his coat billowing behind him. Adrianne gathered her skirts and followed, the heat hitting her face like a physical blow as she drew closer. The smell was overwhelming, burning cotton, scorched wood, and underneath it something sickly sweet that she desperately hoped wasn't burning flesh. "Your Grace!" A man broke from the crowd, his face blackened with smoke, blood streaming from a cut on his forehead. "Thank heaven you've come. It started in the weaving room, spread too fast to contain. We've got most everyone out, but there are still people trapped on the 3rd floor. The main stairwell collapsed, and the fire's blocking the secondary exit." "The emergency ladders," Marcus started. "Not long enough to reach the 3rd floor, sir. We're trying to rig something, but the smoke's too thick and the flames—" The man's voice broke. "We can hear them screaming up there." Marcus's face went absolutely white. Without a word, he started toward the building. Adrianne grabbed his arm. "What are you doing?" "There's a service stairwell in the back. If it's not completely blocked, I can reach the 3rd floor." His eyes were wild now, desperate. "I implemented those safety protocols. I promised those workers they'd be safe. If they're dying because someone ignored my orders, then getting yourself killed won't help them." Adrianne tightened her grip. "You're not a firefighter. You're not trained for this." "Neither are they." Marcus gestured toward the trapped workers. "They're seamstresses and weavers and mothers and children, and they're burning in my building because someone—" He stopped, his chest heaving. "I can't just stand here and watch them die." The raw anguish in his voice struck something deep in Adrianne's chest. This wasn't aristocratic calculation or political maneuvering. This was genuine horror, genuine guilt, genuine desperation to fix something that was spiraling beyond control. "Then we go together," she said firmly. "2 people have a better chance than 1. And I'm smaller. I can fit through spaces you can't." "Adrianne, don't argue. We're wasting time." They ran toward the back of the building, the heat intensifying with every step. The service entrance hung open, smoke pouring from it in thick gray waves. Inside, Adrianne could hear the roar of flames, the crack of breaking timber, the terrifying sound of a building beginning to tear itself apart. Marcus pulled his coat over his head and plunged into the smoke. Adrianne followed, her eyes immediately streaming, her lungs burning as she tried to breathe through her sleeve. The stairwell was narrow and dark, lit only by the hellish glow filtering from above. Heat pressed down on them like a living thing, making every breath an agony. They climbed. Each step was harder than the last, the smoke thicker, the heat more intense. Adrianne's legs trembled, her vision beginning to swim, but she forced herself upward. Somewhere above them, people were dying. That thought was the only thing that kept her moving. The third-floor landing was an inferno. Flames crawled across the ceiling like liquid fire, eating through wooden beams that groaned and cracked. Through the smoke, Adrianne could see huddled shapes, a group of workers pressed against the far wall, trapped between advancing flames and a collapsed stairwell. "Here!" Marcus's voice was barely audible over the roar. "This way! Move quickly!" But the workers weren't moving. They were frozen with terror, their eyes wide and unseeing, paralyzed by the nightmare surrounding them. Adrianne pushed past Marcus and grabbed the nearest woman, young, barely 20, clutching a child against her chest. "Look at me," Adrianne commanded, gripping the woman's shoulders. "Look at me. You have to move now. Take your child and follow us down the back stairs. Do you understand?" The woman's eyes focused slowly, recognition dawning through the panic. "Miss Vale? You're the lady from the newspapers. I'm the lady who's going to get you out of here if you move right now." Adrianne turned to the others. "Everyone, single file, stay low, follow the Duke. Don't stop, don't look back, move." Something in her voice, the absolute certainty, the command that brooked no argument, cut through their panic. They began to move, slowly at first, then faster as Marcus led them toward the service stairs. Adrianne counted as they passed. 8, 9, 10 people. More than she'd expected. More than the narrow stairwell could safely hold if the building started to collapse. "Go!" she shouted to Marcus. "Get them down!" "What about you?" "I'm right behind you. Go!" Marcus hesitated for one agonizing moment, his eyes meeting hers through the smoke. And in that instant, Adrianne saw something she hadn't expected. Genuine fear, not for himself but for her. Then he turned and began shepherding the workers down the stairs, his voice rising above the flames, steady and authoritative, guiding them step by step toward safety. Adrianne turned back to scan the floor one last time. The smoke was so thick now she could barely see 3 feet in front of her. She took 2 steps forward, then heard it, a child's cry, high and terrified, coming from somewhere to her left. She found the boy huddled under a work table, no more than 6 years old, his face streaked with soot and tears. He'd probably been helping his mother, running errands between the machines the way children did in textile mills, earning pennies that meant the difference between eating and starving. "Come here, sweetheart," Adrianne coaxed, reaching toward him. "I'm going to get you out." The boy shook his head violently, too terrified to move. Above them, a ceiling beam groaned ominously. Adrianne didn't think. She simply lunged forward, grabbed the child, and yanked him out from under the table just as the beam gave way with a crack like thunder. The world exploded into chaos. Flaming debris crashed down where the boy had been seconds before, cutting off the path to the service stairs. Adrianne stumbled backward, the child clutched against her chest, heat searing her face and arms. Through the smoke and flames, she could see another route, a secondary corridor that might lead to the emergency stairs on the building's far side. Might being the critical word. She ran, her lungs screaming for air, the child's weight surprising for such a small body. The corridor was narrower than the main floor, flanked by storage rooms filled with cotton and wool, fuel for the inferno consuming the building. Fire raced along the walls like predatory animals, flames leaping from door to door, chasing her. The emergency stairwell materialized through the smoke, a narrow spiral of iron that vibrated with heat but remained passable. Adrianne plunged downward, one hand clutching the child, the other gripping the scorching metal railing, her dress catching fire at the hem. She beat the flames out against the stairs, kept moving, down and down and down, until suddenly she was outside, stumbling into the yard, fresh air hitting her face like a blessing. Someone grabbed her shoulders. A woman screaming, "That's my boy! That's my Tommy!" Adrianne handed over the child and immediately doubled over, coughing so violently she thought her lungs might tear themselves apart. Her vision blurred, her legs gave way, and she felt herself falling toward the ground. Strong hands caught her. Marcus's voice, hoarse from smoke but unmistakable. "I've got you. I've got you." He half carried, half dragged her away from the building to where doctors and volunteers had set up a makeshift treatment area. Someone pressed a wet cloth to her face. Someone else wrapped her burned hands in clean bandages. The world swam in and out of focus,
reality fragmenting into disconnected pieces. The roar of flames, voices shouting orders, the acrid taste of smoke in her mouth. All accounted for, someone was saying. Everyone's out. By some miracle, everyone survived. Not a miracle, another voice replied, awestruck. Did you see them? The Duke himself pulling people from the fire, and that Vale woman. She went back in for little Tommy Morrison. Went back in when the whole building was coming down around her ears. Adrianne's vision cleared slowly. She was sitting on the ground, Marcus beside her, both of them blackened with soot, both breathing in harsh, painful gasps. Around them, the rescued workers were being tended to. Burns treated, smoke inhalation addressed, shock managed by volunteers who'd materialized from surrounding neighborhoods. The mill was still burning, flames consuming it floor by floor, but everyone was alive. Against impossible odds, despite chaos and terror in a building determined to become a funeral pyre, everyone had survived. Marcus turned to look at her, his face streaked with soot and sweat, and something passed between them, an understanding beyond words, a recognition that they'd just survived something that should have killed them, that they'd worked together not as Duke and Merchant's daughter, not as antagonists forced into alliance, but as two people fighting for the same desperate goal. You went back, he said hoarsely. For the child. You went back when the building was collapsing. So did you, Adrianne replied, her voice barely a whisper. You risked everything to save your workers. My workers. My responsibility. Marcus's hands were shaking now, reaction setting in. But you had no obligation to be here at all. You could have stayed in Bath, stayed safe. Instead you... His voice broke. You could have died in there. So could you. They stared at each other, the ruins of the mill burning behind them, and Adrianne felt something shift in her chest, a crack in the armor she'd built around her heart, a dangerous recognition that Duke Marcus Halbrook might be more than she'd assumed. Not just aristocratic power and privilege, but also courage and genuine remorse and a willingness to risk his life for people society considered expendable. A commotion at the edge of the crowd interrupted the moment. A carriage was arriving, expensive, ostentatious, bearing a coat of arms Adrianne vaguely recognized. A man emerged, tall and elegant, his blonde hair perfectly styled despite the late hour. His face wore an expression of theatrical concern that didn't quite reach his cold blue eyes. Marcus, the man hurried forward. Thank heaven you're unharmed. When I heard about the fire, I came immediately. This is catastrophic, absolutely catastrophic. Your reputation, the business implications? My reputation? Marcus's voice was dangerous. 20 people were nearly killed, Cedric. My reputation is the last thing on my mind. Lord Cedric Thornfield. Adrianne recognized him now from London society, Marcus's closest friend and political ally, heir to a fortune that rivaled the Duke's own. He was conventionally handsome in that aristocratic way, all sharp angles and cultivated charm, but there was something in his eyes that made Adrianne's skin crawl. Of course, Cedric said smoothly, though his gaze flickered dismissively over the injured workers. Tragic truly, but you must consider the political ramifications. This fire, coming so soon after those ridiculous accusations about negligence, people will draw conclusions. Your enemies will use this against you. My enemies? Marcus stood slowly, every line of his body radiating exhaustion and barely contained fury. The only enemies I'm concerned with are the ones who might have caused this fire through negligence or sabotage. Something flickered across Cedric's face, too quick to read clearly, but Adrianne caught it. A flash of calculation, of wariness, quickly masked by continued theatrical concern. Sabotage? Marcus, surely you're overwrought. These industrial fires happen all the time. Tragic but inevitable given the nature of textile manufacturing. No one could blame you for... I blame myself, Marcus cut him off harshly. These are my mills, my workers, my responsibility, and I will discover exactly how this started and who, if anyone, failed to implement the safety protocols I ordered. He turned to the mill foreman, who was hovering nearby. Thomas, I want a complete investigation. Interview every supervisor, examine every decision made in the last month. If someone countermanded my safety orders, I want to know who and why. Yes, Your Grace. Though I should mention, the foreman hesitated, glancing nervously at Lord Thornfield.
Some of the new fire protocols were expensive, sir. There was pushback from management about the cost. What kind of pushback? Letters suggesting the modifications were unnecessary, that traditional fire prevention was sufficient, that the new expenses would significantly impact profitability. Thomas pulled a singed paper from his pocket. This came 3 days ago, sir, from Lord Thornfield's estate office, recommending we delay implementation of the additional safety measures until the financial impact could be properly assessed. The silence that followed was absolute. Marcus turned slowly to stare at his friend, his face going completely blank, that aristocratic mask that Adrianne had seen at the Hartwell ball, but underneath it something dark and dangerous. "Cedric," he said softly, "tell me you didn't interfere with my safety protocols." "Interfere?" Cedric laughed, but it sounded forced. "Marcus, I was trying to help. You were hemorrhaging money on these reforms, mines, mills, tenant farms, everything. Someone needed to provide a voice of financial reason. I simply suggested we take a more measured approach. A measured approach that resulted in a fire that nearly killed 20 people. You can't possibly blame me for I ordered those safety measures implemented immediately, Cedric. That means 3 weeks ago, not pending financial assessment. Did you or did you not send orders countermanding mine?" Cedric's perfect facade cracked slightly. "I sent recommendations, suggestions that perhaps we should prioritize which reforms were truly essential versus which were merely expensive gestures designed to appease radical reformers." His gaze flickered to Adrianne with open contempt. "I was trying to protect you from making decisions based on emotion rather than sound business practice." Emotion. Marcus's voice dropped to something barely above a whisper, which somehow made it more terrifying than shouting. "You think preventing deaths is emotion?" "I think you've been distracted lately. Ever since that disaster at the Hartwell ball, you've been acting out of character, apologizing, reforming, spending a fortune to appease people who have no business questioning how you run your estates. And now this woman," he gestured dismissively at Adrianne, "has you running into burning buildings and risking your life for common workers. This isn't you, Marcus. This isn't the man I've known for 20 years. Then perhaps you never knew me at all." The words fell like stones into water. Adrianne watched as Cedric's expression shifted from confident superiority to something that might have been panic, quickly masked, but visible for just a moment. He'd overplayed his hand, revealed too much of his true contempt for the reforms Marcus had been implementing. "Your Grace," a new voice interrupted. Nathan Calder was striding across the yard, his expression grim, several other men following behind him. "Forgive the intrusion, but I came as soon as I heard. My mill is only 3 miles from here. I brought doctors and supplies." His gaze swept the scene, landing on Cedric with sudden sharp attention. "Lord Thornfield, unexpected to see you here." "I came to support my friend in his time of crisis," Cedric replied coldly. "Though I wonder what business brings an industrialist to a duke's private property." "The business of preventing working people from burning to death," Nathan replied bluntly. He turned to Marcus. "Your Grace, my investigators have been examining industrial accidents across the region. We found a pattern: fires, equipment failures, labor disputes, all occurring at facilities owned by nobles who've recently begun implementing worker reforms. Always right when those reforms are most expensive, always just severe enough to create pressure to reverse course. The pattern suggests deliberate sabotage." Marcus's head snapped up. "Sabotage? You're saying someone is deliberately causing industrial accidents?" "I'm saying someone has a vested interest in ensuring that reforming labor conditions remains prohibitively expensive, that anyone who tries to improve worker safety suffers financial catastrophe as a consequence." Nathan pulled documents from his coat. "I have testimony from 3 different sites where accidents occurred shortly after mysterious strangers asked detailed questions about safety protocols and operating schedules. And in each case, those strangers were seen meeting with representatives from—" "That's enough." Cedric's voice cracked like a whip. "These are slanderous accusations with no basis in fact, conspiracy theories designed to excuse incompetent management." "Then you won't mind if we investigate thoroughly," Marcus said quietly. He was staring at his friend now with an expression Adrianne couldn't quite read, dawning comprehension mixed with something that looked like grief. "You won't mind if we trace every decision, every delay, every interference with my reforms back to its source. Will you, Cedric? For the first time since arriving, Lord Cedric Thornfield looked genuinely uncertain. His gaze darted between Marcus, Nathan, and the growing crowd of workers and volunteers who were now openly staring at him with hostile expressions. "This is absurd," he said, but his voice had lost its commanding edge. "Marcus, surely you don't believe I would—" "I don't know what to believe anymore," Marcus interrupted. "But I know this. You sent orders countermanding my safety protocols. You've been pressuring me for weeks to slow down reforms, to reconsider the expense, to think about my reputation more than workers' lives. And now Nathan suggests there's a broader pattern of sabotage targeting reform-minded estates." He stepped forward, his face hard. "Were you involved in this fire, Cedric?" "I was trying to protect you." The admission burst out before Cedric could stop it. The crowd went utterly silent, every eye fixed on the aristocrat who'd just confessed to interfering with safety measures that could have prevented the fire. Cedric seemed to realize his mistake. He straightened, trying to recover his composure. "I was protecting you from your own misguided idealism. These reforms, they're destroying everything we've built. The aristocracy maintains its position through careful management of resources and labor. Start treating workers as equals, start prioritizing their safety over profitability, and the entire system collapses. You were becoming weak, Marcus, influenced by radical reformers and this woman," he spat the word at Adrianne, "who should never have been admitted to civilized society in the first place. So you decided to sabotage my mills." Marcus's voice was flat, emotionless, which somehow made it more damning than rage. "To engineer disasters that would force me back into line. To kill my workers as a lesson in maintaining aristocratic power. I didn't kill anyone. The fire was an accident, inevitable, given the inherent dangers of textile manufacturing. I simply ensured your expensive reforms weren't implemented in time to prevent it. A harsh lesson, perhaps, but necessary to demonstrate why the old ways exist. We maintain order through strength, Marcus, through ruthless management and absolute authority, not through coddling workers and appeasing radicals." The confession hung in the air like poison gas. Adrianne felt her blood turn to ice, felt rage building in her chest so intense it made her hands shake. This man, this cultured, educated, wealthy aristocrat, had deliberately prevented safety measures that could have saved lives, all to prove a point about maintaining social hierarchy. Marcus moved before anyone could stop him. His fist connected with Cedric's jaw with a crack that echoed across the yard. The aristocrat went down hard, blood streaming from his split lip, shock written across his face. "That was for every worker whose life you considered expendable," Marcus said quietly, standing over him. "For every reform you sabotaged, every safety measure you blocked, every death you considered an acceptable cost of maintaining aristocratic power." He turned to the crowd, his voice rising. "Thomas, send for the magistrate. Lord Thornfield will be charged with criminal negligence and reckless endangerment. If the investigation confirms sabotage, we'll add attempted murder." "You can't—" Cedric struggled to his feet, fury and panic warring in his expression. "I'm a peer of the realm. You can't have me arrested on the word of workers and reformers. No court will convict me. No magistrate will even hear the case." "Then I'll make sure the newspapers hear it instead," Adrianne said, her voice cutting through his protests. She stepped forward, her burned hands throbbing but her spine straight, her eyes blazing. "I'll publish every detail of your confession, every document showing your interference with safety protocols. I'll make you so infamous that no amount of aristocratic privilege will protect you from public outrage." "You have no proof." "I have your own words spoken in front of 50 witnesses." Adrianne gestured to the crowd of workers and volunteers, all of whom were now openly hostile, their faces reflecting the rage she felt. "I have the testimony of the mill foreman. I have Nathan's investigation documenting a pattern of sabotage. And I have a public that's increasingly tired of aristocrats who think their position exempts them from basic human decency." Cedric's face twisted with hatred. "You destroyed him. Marcus was the strongest, most ruthless peer in Britain until you infected him with your radical poison. You made him weak, made him question everything we've built. This is your fault, all of it. The reforms, the expenses, the weakness. You did this.
No, Marcus said quietly.
You did this, Cedric. You committed crimes. You endangered lives. You chose profit over human welfare and called it strength. His voice hardened. And now you'll face the consequences. The magistrate arrived within the hour. By then, Nathan's investigators had found additional evidence, correspondence between Cedric's agents and the mill supervisors who'd delayed implementing safety measures, financial records showing payments made to encourage cost-saving measures that compromised worker safety, testimony from other estates where similar patterns had emerged. The case wasn't perfect. Aristocratic privilege would make conviction difficult, if not impossible, through traditional courts. But the evidence was damning enough to destroy Cedric's reputation, to make him a pariah in the very society whose hierarchy he'd been trying to protect. As constables led Cedric away, still protesting his innocence and threatening legal retribution, Marcus stood watching with an expression of profound exhaustion and something that might have been grief. 20 years, he said softly to Adrianne. I've known him for 20 years, trusted him, considered him my closest friend. And all that time, he was willing to let people die to maintain a system that benefits us at their expense. I'm sorry, Adrianne said, and meant it. Whatever anger she'd felt toward Marcus, whatever suspicion, she could see the genuine anguish in his face at this betrayal. I know what it's like to lose people you thought you knew. Marcus turned to look at her, and in his eyes she saw something new. Not the cold aristocratic hauteur of their first meeting, not the controlled politeness of their bath conversation, but something raw and unguarded. Recognition, perhaps, or understanding that they'd just survived something that had stripped away all pretense and revealed who they actually were beneath their social roles. You saved people today, he said quietly. You nearly died saving people you'd never met, workers whose society tells you aren't your responsibility. Why? Because they're human beings, Adrianne replied simply. Because their lives matter as much as ours. Because someone has to stand up for people the system treats as expendable. Even when standing up means risking everything. Especially then. Marcus held her gaze for a long moment, and Adrianne felt something shift between them, a recognition that went beyond their tentative alliance, beyond their shared trauma of the fire. Something more dangerous and more real than anything politics or reform could explain. I need to tell you something, Marcus said abruptly. Before this goes any further, before we continue this alliance, you need to know the truth about me, about who I was before I investigated those mines. I know who you were. Cold, arrogant, absolutely convinced of your own righteousness. Worse than that, Marcus's voice dropped, became almost confessional. I was everything Cedric accused me of being, ruthless, profit-focused, willing to ignore suffering if it meant maintaining my position and fortune. When you confronted me at that ball, I didn't just dismiss your accusations. I actively despised you for having the audacity to question how I ran my estates. I thought you were naive, ignorant, a romantic fool playing at politics without understanding the complexities of power. I know. You made that abundantly clear. What you don't know is that I went to Bath specifically to convince you to stop publishing your exposés. My plan was to intimidate you, remind you of the power differential between us, make you understand that continuing your campaign would destroy what was left of your family's prospects. He paused, his jaw tightening. I was going to threaten you into silence, Adrianne. That was my intention when I wrote that letter. The admission hit like a physical blow. Adrianne stared at him, seeing the shame in his expression, the self-loathing. Then what changed? I investigated first. I thought if I could find errors in your evidence, I could use them to discredit you publicly. So I went to Yorkshire personally, inspected the mines myself instead of relying on reports. And what I found... Marcus's voice broke slightly. What I found destroyed everything I believed about myself, about the system I'd spent my entire life defending. Those mine supports weren't just inadequate, they were criminally negligent. The working conditions weren't just difficult, they were inhumane. And I had allowed it all because I'd never bothered to look, because looking would have been inconvenient. He turned away, staring at the smoking ruins of the mill. When I arrived in Bath, I wasn't coming to negotiate or form an alliance. I was coming to make you stop exposing truths that made me deeply uncomfortable. The fire. It forced me to act before I could follow through on those intentions. and working beside you today, watching you risk your life for people you'd never met, it showed me what actual courage looks like, what actual principle looks like. I'm telling you this because you deserve to know that the man standing here trying to do the right thing is the same man who spent 32 years doing the opposite. And I'm not sure redemption is even possible for that. The air between them felt charged with something dangerous. Adrianne's mind raced, processing this confession, trying to reconcile it with the man who'd just pulled workers from a burning building, who'd punched his oldest friend for endangering lives, who was looking at her now with naked vulnerability that seemed completely at odds with aristocratic power. Redemption isn't something you earn through grand gestures, she said finally. It's something you build through consistent choice, through choosing differently every day, even when it's hard, even when it costs you. She paused, her heart hammering against her ribs. I can't forgive everything you were, but I can acknowledge what you're trying to become. Something flickered in Marcus's eyes, hope, maybe, or gratitude, or something more complicated than either. He opened his mouth to respond, then seemed to think better of it, simply nodding. The moment stretched between them, heavy with things unsaid. Then Nathan approached, his expression concerned. The magistrate wants statements from both of you. And Miss Vale, there are reporters here, London newspapers. They heard about the fire and came expecting scandal. What they found was considerably more interesting. He gestured toward a group of men with notebooks, their eyes bright with the scent of a major story. The Duke and the radical reformer, working together to save workers from a burning mill. One of the Duke's closest friends arrested for sabotage. It's going to be front-page news across Britain. Adrianne felt her stomach clench. Front-page news meant her family would be dragged back into the spotlight. Her father's struggling business would face renewed scrutiny. Charlotte's already damaged prospects would become completely unsalvageable. Marcus must have seen something in her face because he stepped closer, his voice low and urgent. Let me handle the reporters. I'll take responsibility for everything, the fire, the investigation, the arrests. I'll keep your name out of it. No. The word came out firmly, decisively. Adrianne had spent weeks in Bath wrestling with guilt over her family's suffering, but standing here, looking at the workers who'd survived because she and Marcus had refused to stay safe, she realized something crucial. Silence protected nothing that mattered. No more hiding, no more exile. If we're going to change anything, we face this together, publicly. Marcus stared at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. That will make you a target, not just for Cedric's allies, but for every aristocrat who feels threatened by reform. You'll be painted as a dangerous radical, a woman who doesn't know her place, an enemy of the social order. I've been called all of that already. At least this time it'll be accurate. Something that might have been admiration crossed Marcus's face, or possibly something deeper, something more personal, quickly masked but visible for just a moment. Then we face it together, he agreed quietly. Partners in this insanity. Partners? Adrianne echoed and felt the weight of that word, the commitment it implied. Not just political alliance, but something that felt dangerously close to trust. They gave their statements to the magistrate as the sun set over London, turning the smoking ruins of the mill into a hellscape of orange and shadow. They spoke to the reporters together, presenting a united front, the Duke explaining his reforms and Cedric's betrayal, Adrianne providing context about the broader pattern of industrial negligence and the need for systematic change. The reporters scribbled furiously, their expressions ranging from shock to fascination to barely concealed glee at the scandal unfolding before them. This wasn't just news. This was the story that would dominate British society for months. A duke turning against his own class, allying with a disgraced merchant's daughter, accusing his closest friend of attempted murder through criminal negligence. As the last reporter departed and evening descended fully, Adrianne realized with sudden exhaustion that she had nowhere to go. Her family's London house would be closed. They couldn't afford to maintain it during her exile. Her aunt was in Bath. She was filthy, injured, wearing a dress that was half burned and completely ruined. You'll stay at Halbrook House tonight, Marcus said, as if reading her thoughts. It's not a request or an implication. It's simple logistics. You need medical attention for your burns, food, rest, and clean clothes before you decide your next move. My mother is in residence and will serve as chaperone if you're concerned about propriety. I stopped caring about propriety when I went back into a burning building. Marcus's mouth twitched in what might have been a smile. Fair point, but the offer stands regardless. Halbrook House was everything Adrianne had imagined, and worse. A massive Mayfair mansion that spoke of centuries of accumulated wealth and power. Servants materialized to attend to her injuries, to draw her a bath, to provide clothes borrowed from Marcus's sister's wardrobe. The Dowager Duchess, a formidable woman with silver hair and eyes exactly like her son's, welcomed Adrianne with surprising warmth. "So you're the young woman who's been reforming my son," she said, studying Adrianne with sharp intelligence. "I must say, I approve. Marcus needed someone to shake him out of his aristocratic complacency, though I'm not sure either of you realized you'd end up fighting fires together." "Neither did we, Your Grace. Please call me Catherine. Anyone who saves my son from a burning building has earned the right to informal address." The Dowager's expression grew more serious. "But you should know. What happened today will have consequences far beyond Cedric's arrest. The aristocracy will see Marcus's alliance with you as a betrayal of his class. They'll move against him, against you, against everything you're trying to accomplish. You've made powerful enemies." "I know. And yet you continue anyway. Fascinating." Catherine studied her with those penetrating eyes. "Do you love my son, Miss Vale?" The question hit like a lightning strike. Adrianne felt her face flush, felt her heart stutter in her chest. That's not... We barely know each other." "That's not an answer." Catherine's smile was knowing. "But it's revealing nonetheless. Be careful, child. Hearts are more dangerous than politics, and you're now navigating both." Late that night, unable to sleep despite exhaustion, Adrianne found herself in Halbrook House's library. The room was magnificent, floor-to-ceiling books, leather chairs, a fireplace large enough to stand in. She was examining a first edition of political philosophy when Marcus entered, still wearing the clothes he'd fought the fire in, his face drawn with exhaustion. "I thought you'd be asleep," he said. "I thought you would be too." They stood in the lamplight, the vast library surrounding them, and Adrianne felt the air between them thick with everything unspoken. The terror of the fire, the betrayal by his closest friend, the recognition that something had fundamentally changed between them in that burning mill. "Cedric was right about one thing," Marcus said quietly. "You did change me. From the moment you confronted me at that ball, you've been forcing me to see things I'd spent my entire life avoiding. You made me look at the cost of my privilege, the suffering my comfort was built on. You made me question everything I thought I knew about power and responsibility and what it means to be worthy of my position. I didn't mean to. I know. That's what makes it remarkable. You weren't trying to reform me or save my soul. You were simply refusing to stay silent in the face of injustice, regardless of the cost to yourself. And somehow that was more transformative than any amount of intentional persuasion could have been." He stepped closer, and Adrianne's breath caught. In the firelight, his features softened, the aristocratic coldness replaced by something warmer, more human, more dangerous. "I need to tell you something else," Marcus said, his voice dropping. "Something I didn't intend to feel and certainly didn't want to admit." "Marcus, I'm falling in love with you, Adrianne." The words came out raw, unguarded. Somewhere between your courage at that ballroom and your fury in Bath and your absolute fearlessness running into that fire, I fell completely and irrevocably in love with you, and I have no idea what to do about it because you're everything I was raised to dismiss as unsuitable, and you have every reason to despise me for who I was, and this is possibly the worst possible timing to confess something like this, but Adrianne kissed him. She didn't think about it, didn't calculate consequences or consider propriety. She simply closed the distance between them and pressed her lips to his, feeling him freeze in shock for one heartbeat before his arms came around her, pulling her close, kissing her back with an intensity that took her breath away. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Marcus rested his forehead against hers. "That was either the best decision you've ever made, or the worst," he whispered. "I have no idea which," Adrianne admitted. "But I'm tired of letting fear dictate every choice. I'm tired of staying safe when everything that matters requires risk. Then risk this with me." Marcus's hands cupped her face gently, mindful of her injuries. "Help me be better than I was. Hold me accountable. Fight beside me.
I know I don't deserve you, that I've done nothing to earn this, but stop apologizing for who you were and start being who you want to become." He kissed her again, softer this time, and Adrianne felt her carefully constructed walls crumbling. She was falling for a duke, a man who represented everything wrong with the system she'd been fighting, a man who was also brave and honest and willing to change in ways that defied everything his upbringing had taught him. This was either salvation or disaster. Probably both. Outside Halbrook House, London settled into uneasy sleep, unaware that tomorrow's newspapers would carry stories that would shake British society to its foundations, that a duke and a merchant's daughter had forged an alliance that would challenge centuries of aristocratic power, that the careful hierarchy maintaining social order was beginning to crack in dangerous, irreversible ways. And in a cell across the city, Lord Cedric Thornfield sat plotting his revenge, his aristocratic pride burning hotter than any mill fire, his hatred focused with laser precision on the woman who'd destroyed everything he'd worked to protect. The war was just beginning. The morning newspapers arrived at Halbrook House like artillery shells, each headline more explosive than the last. Duke Halbrook accuses peer of attempted murder. Aristocrat arrested for industrial sabotage fire at Halbrook Mill. Heroic rescue or political theater? Adrianne sat in the breakfast room, her bandaged hands making it difficult to turn the pages, reading account after account of yesterday's events. Some papers treated the story with appropriate gravity, documenting the evidence against Cedric with journalistic precision. Others took a more sensational approach, focusing on the unprecedented nature of a duke publicly turning against his own class, allying with a known radical, rescuing workers personally from flames. And then there was the Morning Chronicle, whose editorial made her blood run cold. The dangerous radicalism of Miss Adrianne Vale has now infected one of Britain's most distinguished peers, the piece began. Duke Marcus Halbrook, formerly a pillar of aristocratic virtue and responsible stewardship, has been led astray by a woman whose very presence at the Hartwell charity ball months ago demonstrated her unfitness for civilized society. Now we see the fruits of her influence, false accusations against Lord Thornfield, a respected peer, based on the testimony of common workers and radical industrialists. This alliance between Duke and merchant's daughter represents a threat not merely to Lord Thornfield's reputation, but to the very foundations of British social order. One must ask, is His Grace acting of his own volition, or has he fallen victim to feminine manipulation of the most dangerous kind? Feminine manipulation. Adrianne's voice was bitter as Marcus entered the breakfast room. Of course, when a woman speaks truth to power, she's manipulating. When she refuses to stay silent, she's dangerous. When she actually accomplishes something, she must have used her wiles to deceive some helpless male. Marcus poured coffee with controlled fury. I've read it. Half the morning papers have taken similar angles. You're either a scheming seductress who's corrupted me, or a naive fool I'm cynically using for political advantage. Apparently, we can't simply be two people working toward the same goals. Welcome to what it's like being a woman in the public sphere, Adrianne set down the paper. Every accomplishment questioned, every motive scrutinized, every action interpreted through the lens of your gender rather than your actual choices. Marcus sat across from her, his face drawn with exhaustion and something darker, a fury that burned cold rather than hot. Cedric's family has already retained 3 of London's most expensive barristers. They're preparing to challenge his arrest, claiming the magistrate exceeded his authority in charging a peer. And they're not just defending him, they're going on the offensive, spreading rumors that I've had some kind of nervous collapse, that you've used feminine arts to cloud my judgment, that the fire was actually an accident caused by my own ill-considered safety reforms. Will it work? With some people, certainly. The aristocracy protects its own, and Cedric's family has deep connections, but Marcus pulled a thick envelope from his coat. Nathan sent this over early this morning. His investigators have been working through the night. Adrianne opened the envelope with difficulty, her burned fingers protesting. Inside were dozens of documents, financial records, correspondence, testimony from workers at multiple estates. As she read, a pattern emerged that was both clearer and more damning than anything they'd suspected. Cedric hadn't been acting alone. He'd been coordinating with a network of estate managers and aristocratic allies, all working to undermine reform efforts across Britain.
The sabotage at Marcus's mill was just one piece of a larger campaign designed to make improving working conditions so expensive and dangerous that reformers would be forced to abandon their efforts. There were similar incidents at other estates, mines that collapsed just after safety improvements were announced, machinery that mysteriously malfunctioned following new operating procedures, labor disputes that erupted whenever owners tried to implement better conditions. It's systematic, Adrianne breathed. They've created a whole infrastructure designed to punish anyone who tries to reform. And they've been doing it for years, long before you confronted me at that ball. Your accusations and my subsequent investigation simply accelerated their timeline, made them desperate enough to take bigger risks. Marcus's jaw tightened. The question now is what we do about it. We have evidence that could implicate dozens of aristocrats and managers in criminal conspiracy. But bringing charges would mean war, Adrianne finished quietly. Complete war with the aristocracy. They'd circle the wagons, use every ounce of their power and influence to destroy the accusations and everyone making them. Exactly. We'd be fighting the entire British upper class, and they have resources and connections we can't match. Even with Nathan's support, even with public sympathy from the fire, going after this many powerful people simultaneously would be suicide. They sat in silence, the morning sun streaming through the breakfast room windows, illuminating the documents that represented both devastating evidence and impossible odds. Adrianne's mind raced through possibilities, strategies, approaches. Direct confrontation would be crushed. But silence meant accepting that the system would continue unchanged, that Cedric's network would keep sabotaging reforms, that workers would keep dying to maintain aristocratic profits. We need to be strategic, she said slowly. Not emotional, not reactive, strategic. What are you thinking? I'm thinking that Cedric and his allies expect us to either back down or attack directly. Either choice plays into their hands, backing down validates their methods, while attacking gives them the opportunity to paint us as dangerous radicals, destroying innocent peers. Adrianne looked up at Marcus. So we do neither. We offer Cedric an alternative. Marcus frowned. What kind of alternative? Exile. The word came out flat, final. We have evidence that could destroy him. Criminal charges, public scandal, complete ruin. But we also have the power to make that evidence disappear. We offer him a choice. Leave Britain quietly, permanently, never to return, or face prosecution and public humiliation that will annihilate not just him, but his entire family's reputation. That's not justice. No, Adrianne agreed. It's not. Justice would be seeing him in prison, seeing him answer for every death his sabotage caused. But justice also means thinking about the bigger picture. If we prosecute Cedric publicly, his allies will fight back with everything they have. The case could drag on for years, consuming resources and energy we need for actual reform. His family will be destroyed, including people who had nothing to do with his crimes. And in the end, aristocratic privilege might mean he gets away with it anyway. She paused, choosing her words carefully. But if he disappears quietly, his network loses its center. His allies will be too worried about their own exposure to continue coordinating sabotage. And we keep the evidence as leverage, insurance that ensures his entire conspiracy stays silent. Marcus stared at her with an expression that might have been admiration, or possibly alarm. You're suggesting we blackmail a peer into permanent exile rather than pursue legal justice. I'm suggesting we choose effectiveness over satisfaction. Cedric in prison for a few years, if we could even accomplish that, doesn't stop the system. Cedric gone, his network frightened into inaction, and our evidence held as insurance against future sabotage, that actually protects workers. It's ruthless. Yes. Adrianne met his gaze directly. It is. I spent months thinking passion and righteousness would be enough, that simply speaking truth would change things. But I've learned that changing systems requires more than moral clarity. It requires strategic thinking. Sometimes it requires being as calculating as the people we're fighting against. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming on the table, the only sign of his internal struggle. Finally, he nodded slowly. It goes against every instinct of wanting to see him punished publicly. But you're right. This accomplishes more than a trial that might fail anyway. He paused. When did you become so strategically minded? When I realized that getting myself exiled to Bath accomplished nothing except making me feel righteous. Real change requires thinking 10 moves ahead, not just making one dramatic gesture. They spent the morning preparing their approach with Nathan and Helena Ashford, who'd arrived from Bath upon reading the newspaper accounts. The Dowager Duchess Catherine joined them as well, her sharp political mind immediately grasping both the opportunity and the risks. Cedric will resist, Catherine warned. He's proud, arrogant, and genuinely believes he was protecting the social order. Convincing him to accept exile won't be easy. We don't need to convince him it's right, Adrianne replied. We just need to convince him it's better than the alternative. Nathan had arranged a meeting at his London office, neutral territory where Cedric could be brought without attracting attention. The peer was released from custody on his family's recognizance, technically awaiting trial, but effectively free, while expensive lawyers worked to dismiss the charges. He arrived at Nathan's office with 2 barristers and an expression of cold fury barely contained beneath aristocratic composure. His jaw was still bruised from Marcus's punch, a visible reminder of how completely his world had shifted in less than 24 hours. This is highly irregular, one of the barristers began. My client agreed to this meeting as a courtesy, but we see no reason. Your client will want to hear what we have to say, Marcus interrupted, his voice carrying absolute authority. Alone. Just the 4 of us. Lord Thornfield, Miss Vale, Mr. Calder, and myself. Cedric studied Marcus for a long moment, then nodded curtly to his lawyers. Wait outside. The barristers protested, but eventually complied, leaving the 4 of them in Nathan's office. Cedric remained standing, his posture rigid, his eyes blazing with barely suppressed rage. You've destroyed 20 years of friendship, he said flatly. 20 years, Marcus? For what? For workers who don't even understand they're being helped? For this woman who's turned you against your own class? For principle, Marcus replied quietly. For the recognition that our position comes with responsibilities beyond maintaining our own power. But we're not here to debate philosophy, Cedric. We're here to offer you a choice. Nathan spread the documents across the desk, all the evidence they'd compiled damning and comprehensive. Cedric's face went progressively paler as he examined them, seeing the full scope of what they'd discovered about his conspiracy. This evidence could put you in prison for decades, Adrianne said, her voice neutral, businesslike. Criminal conspiracy, attempted murder through negligence, fraud, sabotage. Your family's reputation would be destroyed. Your title would be stripped. You'd lose everything. Then why are you showing it to me instead of taking it to the authorities? Because we're giving you an alternative, Marcus said. Leave Britain permanently. Go to the continent, to America, to anywhere that isn't here. Take enough money to live comfortably but without power or influence. Disappear completely from British society and never return. Cedric's laugh was harsh and bitter. Exile. You're offering me exile like some Roman senator. We're offering you your life and your family's reputation, Adrianne corrected, in exchange for your permanent absence and your silence. Accept, and this evidence never sees a courtroom. Your family claims you've chosen to pursue business opportunities abroad. Society forgets about you within 6 months. Refuse, and we prosecute with everything we have, your choice. This isn't justice. No, Marcus agreed. It's strategy. You coordinated a network designed to undermine reform through violence and sabotage. Justice would be seeing you hang, but prosecuting you means years of trials, appeals, scandal that would hurt innocent members of your family. And there's a chance, however small, that your connections and expensive lawyers might get you acquitted despite the evidence. This way, you're gone. Your network is dismantled, workers are protected, and your family doesn't suffer for your crimes. Cedric stared at Marcus with an expression of pure hatred. You were the strongest of us, the most committed to maintaining our position. And he gestured viciously at Adrianne, she corrupted you, made you weak, made you betray everything we stand for. She made me see that what we stood for was built on suffering we chose to ignore, Marcus replied, his voice hardening. That strength isn't measured by how ruthlessly you exploit those beneath you, but by whether you use your power to build something better than what you inherited. You call that weakness. I call it growing a conscience. A conscience, Cedric's voice dripped contempt. Aristocrats don't need consciences. We need strength, authority, the will to maintain order regardless of cost. That's what preserves civilization, Marcus, not your bleeding heart reforms and radical allies. The civilization you're preserving is the one that kills 7 miners to save 4% in profits, Adrianne said flatly. The one that lets children lose fingers in machinery because safety improvements cost money. The one that maintains your comfort by grinding other people into dust. If that's what you're fighting to preserve, then yes, we're absolutely trying to destroy it. The office fell silent except for the ticking of Nathan's desk clock. Cedric looked at the documents again, at the overwhelming evidence of his crimes, at the 3 faces watching him with varying degrees of hostility and determination. His aristocratic pride warred visibly with survival instinct. "How long do I have to decide?" he asked finally, his voice hollow. 24 hours, Nathan replied. "After that, we take everything to the magistrate and every newspaper in London. You'll be front-page news for months." "And if I accept? What guarantees do I have that you won't publish this evidence anyway?" "My word," Marcus said simply. "Which you once trusted absolutely, and which you betrayed by sabotaging reforms that could have saved lives. But unlike you, I keep my promises. Accept exile, and this evidence disappears. We'll even help fabricate a plausible story, business opportunities in America perhaps, or health reasons requiring a warmer climate. Your reputation remains intact, your family suffers no scandal, and you live out your days in comfortable obscurity." Cedric's hands were shaking now, rage and fear and wounded pride all visible in his expression. "I hate you," he said quietly. "Both of you. You've destroyed everything I worked to protect. Everything we built together, Marcus. 20 years of friendship gone. For what? For workers who will just find new ways to complain no matter how you try to help them? For reforms that will ultimately bankrupt estates and weaken Britain's economic power? For this woman who should never have been admitted to civilized society? For the recognition that civilization means more than maintaining aristocratic privilege," Marcus replied. "For the understanding that our position comes with responsibilities we'd been ignoring. For the chance to build something better than what we inherited." He paused. "And yes, Cedric, for Adrianne, who has more courage and principle in her burned hands than you've demonstrated in your entire life." The confession hung in the air, more revealing than Marcus probably intended. Adrianne felt heat rising in her cheeks but kept her expression neutral, professional. This was business, strategy, not the moment for personal feelings. Cedric saw it anyway, saw the truth in Marcus's voice, the way his gaze flickered to Adrianne, the protective edge in his tone. His expression twisted into something ugly. "You're in love with her," he said, and it sounded like an accusation. "The Duke of Halbrook, in love with a merchant's daughter. A radical reformer who destroyed your reputation at a charity ball. How far you've fallen, Marcus. How completely she's unmanned you. How completely she's made me recognize I was wasting my life maintaining a system built on cruelty," Marcus corrected coldly. "Now, do you accept our terms or not?" The clock ticked. Cedric stared at the documents, at the evidence that could destroy him, at the 3 people who held his future in their hands. Finally, he nodded once, sharp and bitter. "I accept. I'll leave Britain within the month. You'll never see me again." His voice was venomous. "But know this, you've won this battle, but the war is far from over. There are dozens more who believe as I do, who will fight to preserve the natural order against your radical reforms. You've made an enemy of everyone who matters, Marcus, and they'll find ways to stop you that I never imagined." "Let them try," Adrianne said quietly. "We're not afraid of aristocrats who hide behind titles and traditions. Not anymore." Cedric left without another word, his lawyers trailing behind him, his shoulders stiff with wounded pride and suppressed fury. When the door closed, Nathan let out a long breath. "That was either brilliant or incredibly foolish," he said. "Possibly both." "It was necessary," Marcus replied. He looked drained, years older than when the meeting had started. "Cedric was my closest friend for 2 decades. Exiling him, it's like cutting off a limb, but a gangrenous limb that would have poisoned everything if left attached." "You did the right thing," Adrianne said softly. "The hard thing, but the right thing." Marcus turned to look at her, and something in his expression made her breath catch. Exhaustion and grief, and something else, something warmer and more vulnerable. "Did I?"
Or did I just choose personal comfort over actual justice because I couldn't bear the thought of years of public trials and scandal? You chose effectiveness over vengeance. There's a difference. Adrianne moved closer, very aware of Nathan and Helena, watching but beyond caring. Cedric in exile protects workers better than Cedric in a prolonged trial that might fail. You made the strategic choice, not the satisfying one. That's harder, not easier. When did you become so wise? When I realized righteousness without strategy is just noise. Beautiful noise, maybe, but ultimately ineffective. She paused, then added quietly, I've learned a lot in the past few months about power, about change, about how to actually accomplish things rather than just making dramatic gestures. Marcus smiled, small and tired, but genuine. And I've learned that sometimes dramatic gestures are exactly what's needed to wake people up. We balance each other out. The moment stretched between them, heavy with implications that went far beyond political alliance. Helena cleared her throat delicately, breaking the spell. If we're done watching you two have meaningful eye contact, she said dryly, we should discuss next steps. Cedric's network is still out there, and they'll be looking for new leadership now that he's gone. We need to move quickly before they regroup. Over the following week, they worked with ruthless efficiency. Nathan's investigators identified other members of Cedric's conspiracy and approached them quietly with similar offers: cooperate with reform efforts and avoid prosecution, or face exposure and ruin. Most accepted, recognizing that the game had changed, that the old system of unchecked aristocratic power was cracking in ways they couldn't ignore. Marcus used his position to push for parliamentary investigations into industrial working conditions, leveraging his status as a peer who'd personally witnessed negligence and its consequences. The fact that he was a duke made his testimony impossible to dismiss as radical propaganda or working-class agitation. Adrianne wrote article after article, documenting not just problems but solutions, specific reforms that had worked at Nathan's mills, at Marcus's estates, at other properties where owners had genuinely committed to improving conditions. She provided evidence that better treatment didn't mean bankruptcy, that safe working environments could coexist with profitable businesses, that the aristocracy's fears of economic collapse were largely unfounded. The public response was overwhelming. Workers' groups organized rallies supporting the reforms. Reform-minded clergy preached sermons about moral responsibility and Christian duty. Even some newspapers that had initially dismissed Adrianne as a radical began running sympathetic editorials, acknowledging that perhaps industrial conditions needed examination. But the aristocracy fought back with everything they had. Social pressure intensified. Marcus found himself increasingly isolated from peers who viewed his alliance with Adrianne as betrayal of his class. Invitations dried up, old friends crossed the street to avoid speaking to him, whispers followed him through clubs and parliamentary halls. The attacks on Adrianne were worse. Rumors spread that she was Marcus's mistress, that she'd used feminine wiles to cloud his judgment, that she was secretly connected to dangerous revolutionary movements, planning to overthrow the monarchy. The Morning Chronicle ran a series of editorials painting her as the most dangerous woman in Britain, a radical feminist whose influence threatened to destroy the natural order of society. They're trying to isolate us, Adrianne said one evening at Halbrook House, where she'd been effectively living for the past week despite the scandalous implications. The Dowager Duchess's presence as chaperone provided minimal respectability, but everyone knew the situation was highly irregular. Make us so toxic that no one else will support our reforms for fear of association. It's working with some people, Marcus admitted. They were in his study, papers and documents covering every surface, evidence, proposals, correspondence with potential allies. But others are starting to come around. Lord Hastings approached me yesterday at Parliament, said he'd been reviewing conditions on his estates and found them appalling, asked for recommendations on reforms. One peer isn't enough. No, but it's a beginning. Marcus looked up from the report he was reading. We're shifting the conversation, Adrianne, slowly, painfully, but we're shifting it. 6 months ago, no one in the aristocracy would even discuss working conditions. Now they're debating it in Parliament. That's progress. Progress that could disappear the moment we lose momentum. Then we don't lose momentum. Marcus set down the report and moved to where Adrianne stood by the window, looking out at the London night.
We keep pushing, keep fighting, keep demonstrating that reform is both morally necessary and practically achievable. And we do it together. He was standing very close now, close enough that Adrianne could feel the warmth radiating from him, could see the exhaustion and determination in his eyes. They'd been working side by side for days, falling into an easy partnership that felt both natural and dangerous. Too natural, too easy, too much like something more than political alliance. "Marcus," she said quietly, "people are already accusing me of being your mistress. Staying here, working together like this, it's destroying what's left of my reputation." "I know." His voice was low, intense. "And I know I should care more about your reputation than I do. But the truth is, Adrianne, I don't. I care about you being safe, being able to continue this work, being somewhere I can see you're all right. If that makes me selfish or improper, so be it. That's not how this works. You can't just dismiss social consequences because you've decided you don't care about them." "Can't I? What's society going to do? Ostracize me more than they already have? Refuse me entry to clubs I no longer want to attend? I've already chosen my side in this fight, and it's not the side of aristocrats who think maintaining their comfort justifies any amount of suffering." Adrianne turned to face him fully. "And what about my family? My father's business is still struggling. My sister will never make a good match with this scandal attached to our name. My mother hasn't written to me in 2 weeks because she's so ashamed. I can choose to sacrifice my own reputation, but I can't make that choice for them." "Then let me help them." Marcus caught her hands gently, mindful of her healing burns. "I have resources, connections, influence. I can ensure your father's business not only survives but thrives. I can help Charlotte make a match with someone who values character over scandal. You can't fix everything with money and power," Adrianne interrupted, though she didn't pull her hands away. "That's the kind of thinking that created this system in the first place. I'm not trying to fix everything with power. I'm trying to fix one specific problem, that you're bearing consequences for choices we both made. Let me help carry that burden." They stood close enough that Adrianne could see the flecks of gold in his gray eyes, could feel his breath on her face, could sense how easy it would be to close the remaining distance and kiss him again like she had that night in the library. How easy and how dangerous, because every moment they spent together, every public appearance, every rumor confirmed made the accusations of impropriety harder to deny. A knock at the study door broke the moment. The Dowager Duchess entered, her expression unusually grave. "Forgive the interruption, but you need to see this." She handed Marcus a sealed letter. "It just arrived by special courier, from Parliament." Marcus broke the seal and read quickly, his face going progressively paler. When he finished, he looked up at Adrianne with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Parliament has agreed to form a select committee investigating industrial working conditions across Britain," he said quietly. "They want to begin hearings next month, and they've requested that both of us testify, me as a peer who's implemented reforms, and you as the person who first raised public concerns about negligence." Adrianne felt her heart skip. "Parliament is listening?" "Parliament is listening," Marcus confirmed. "We did it, Adrianne. We actually got their attention. Now we just have to convince them to act." The implications crashed over her like a wave. Testifying before Parliament meant facing hostile questioning from peers who viewed her as a dangerous radical. It meant presenting evidence under oath, where any error or exaggeration could be used to discredit everything they'd accomplished. It meant stepping fully into the public sphere in a way that would make previous scandals look trivial by comparison. It also meant a genuine chance to change things, to turn their scattered reforms into systematic legislation, to protect not just workers on Marcus's estates or Nathan's mills, but workers across all of Britain. "When do they want us?" she asked. 3 weeks, time enough to prepare testimony and gather supporting documentation. Marcus was still holding her hands, she realized. Neither of them had moved apart despite his mother's presence. "Are you ready for this? Once you testify before Parliament, there's no going back. You'll be the most visible female reformer in Britain, a target for everyone who fears change." "I've been a target since the night I confronted you at that ball," Adrianne replied. "At least this time it'll accomplish something concrete." The Dowager Duchess was watching them with an expression of careful calculation. "You realize what this means, don't you?" The two of you working together, testifying together, publicly allied in pursuit of reform? Society won't just call her your mistress anymore. They'll call her your political partner. That's almost more scandalous. Good, Marcus said flatly. Let them be scandalized. Let them realize that power and position can be used for more than maintaining comfortable privilege. Let them see that a duke and a merchant's daughter can accomplish more together than aristocrats manage in their isolated superiority. His mother smiled, small and knowing. You're in love with her. It wasn't a question. Marcus didn't deny it. He simply looked at Adrianne with such naked emotion that she felt her breath catch, felt her carefully maintained composure cracking. Yes, he said simply. I am. Completely and irrevocably, in ways that defy every expectation I was raised with, and I don't care who knows it. The Dowager Duchess sighed. Well then, I suppose we'd better prepare for a wedding because continuing this alliance without marriage would destroy what's left of both your reputations. Though I suspect that's probably what you were both heading toward anyway, whether you'd admitted it yet or not. Mother, Marcus started, don't mother me. I've watched you two dance around each other for a week, seen the way you look at her, heard how your voice changes when you talk about her. You're more alive now than you've been in years, more passionate, more committed to something beyond aristocratic duty. She turned to Adrianne. And you, my dear, have been equally obvious. You argue with him like someone who cares deeply about his character, work beside him like true partners, trust him in ways that go beyond political alliance. The question isn't whether you love each other. It's whether you're both brave enough to acknowledge it publicly. Adrianne felt her face burning. Your Grace, this isn't… We haven't what? Haven't discussed marriage? Haven't admitted your feelings? Haven't planned a future together? Catherine's smile was gentle now. Sometimes love arrives inconveniently, in forms we didn't expect, with people we weren't supposed to meet. But that doesn't make it any less real. And frankly, given the battles you're about to fight, you'll need that foundation. Marcus was watching Adrianne with an intensity that made her feel exposed, vulnerable, more frightened than she'd been facing the fire or Cedric's threats. Because this was different. This was personal in ways that politics and reform could never be. Adrianne, he said quietly, and in her name she heard a question. She thought about this past months, the confrontation at the ball that had started everything, the exile to Bath that should have ended her involvement, the fire where they'd worked together saving lives, the kiss in the library that had changed something fundamental between them. She thought about testifying before Parliament, about the battles still ahead, about fighting to change a system that resisted transformation with every ounce of its considerable power. She thought about doing all of that alone. And then she thought about doing it with Marcus beside her, infuriating and privileged and learning to be better, matching her passion with his resources, her courage with his position, her determination with his growing conviction that they were fighting for something that mattered more than aristocratic tradition. Ask me properly, she said finally. Marcus blinked. Now? You said you don't care who knows you love me. Your mother just said we should get married, and we're about to testify before Parliament as political partners. Adrianne smiled, feeling reckless and terrified, and more certain than she'd been about anything in her life. So ask me properly, Your Grace, on one knee, the way it's done. Ask if I'll marry you despite every reason it's a terrible idea. For a moment, Marcus just stared at her, surprise and hope, and something like awe crossing his features. Then, moving slowly as if this moment might shatter like glass, he dropped to one knee in his own study, taking her bandaged hands in his, looking up at her with those winter-gray eyes that had once been so cold and were now burning with warmth. Adrianne Vale, he said, his voice rough with emotion, will you marry me? Will you stand beside me in Parliament, in drawing rooms and burning buildings if necessary? Will you argue with me when I'm wrong, support me when I'm right, and force me to be better than I was? Will you let me spend the rest of my life trying to deserve you? That's not how proposals usually work, the Dowager Duchess murmured, but she was smiling. Yes, Adrianne said, her voice barely above a whisper. Yes, I'll marry you. Against all reason and propriety and common sense, yes. Marcus stood and kissed her, properly this time. Not the desperate fire of their first kiss, but something deeper and more certain, a promise rather than a question. When they finally broke apart, both were trembling. London society is going to absolutely explode, Catherine observed cheerfully. A duke marrying a merchant's daughter who publicly humiliated him. A marriage founded on political alliance and shared reform efforts rather than appropriate social connections. The scandal will be glorious. I can't wait. Neither can I, Marcus said, still looking at Adrianne as if he couldn't quite believe she was real. When the engagement is announced, we'll do it properly. Full formal notice, ball at Halbrook House, everything traditional society expects. We'll show them that this isn't some desperate impropriety. It's a deliberate choice, a partnership we're proud of. They'll still call me a gold digger who trapped you. They'll call you the future Duchess of Halbrook, whether they like it or not. 3 weeks later, the engagement was announced publicly. The reactions ranged from scandalized to supportive, with most of the aristocracy falling firmly into the scandalized category. But there were others, reform-minded peers, workers' groups, progressive clergy, who saw the marriage as a symbol of something larger. A duke choosing principle over tradition, allying himself permanently with someone who challenged rather than confirmed his privilege. The parliamentary hearings began on a cold morning in early autumn. Adrianne stood outside the committee room, wearing a dark blue dress that Charlotte had sent with a brief note. Make them listen. I believe in you. Marcus stood beside her, solid and certain in his formal parliamentary robes, his hand on her back in a gesture of support that was both public and defiant. Ready? He asked quietly. No, Adrianne admitted, but I'm doing it anyway. They walked into the chamber together, Duke and merchant's daughter, peer and radical, partners about to testify before the highest legislative body in Britain. The committee members watched them enter with expressions ranging from curiosity to hostility, but they were watching. They were listening. And for the first time since that night at the Hartwell Ball, Adrianne felt something she hadn't expected. Hope. Not naive hope that one testimony would change everything, but strategic hope, built on evidence and allies and the knowledge that they'd already shifted the conversation in ways no one had thought possible. Hope that change, real change, might actually be achievable if they fought for it with everything they had. The door closed behind them. Marcus squeezed her hand once, quickly, then released it as they took their positions before the committee. And Adrianne Vale, disgraced merchant's daughter, radical reformer, future Duchess of Halbrook, began to speak. The parliamentary committee chamber was smaller than Adrianne had imagined, more intimate and somehow more intimidating for it. 12 men sat in a semicircle, peers and members of parliament, their faces ranging from openly hostile to cautiously curious. Gas lamps cast flickering light across dark wood paneling and leather-bound volumes, giving the room the feel of a gentleman's club rather than a legislative body, which Adrianne supposed was exactly what it was. Lord Pemberton, the committee chairman, cleared his throat with obvious displeasure. He was an elderly peer, his face creased with disapproval, his wig slightly askew. Miss Vale, Your Grace, this committee has agreed to hear testimony regarding industrial working conditions, though I must note for the record that the propriety of allowing a woman, an unmarried woman, to testify before Parliament is highly irregular. Miss Vale is engaged to be married to His Grace, the Duke of Halbrook, another committee member interjected smoothly. This was Lord Hastings, the peer who'd approached Marcus about estate reforms. And her testimony is relevant given that she was among the first to raise public concerns about these conditions. Surely we can set aside questions of propriety in service of investigating matters of such importance? Investigating allegations, Pemberton corrected sharply, which have not been proven and which some believe to be exaggerated by radical reformers with political motivations. Then perhaps we should hear the testimony and evaluate the evidence rather than prejudging it, Marcus said, his voice carrying the absolute authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. That is, after all, the purpose of this committee. Pemberton's face reddened, but he gestured for them to begin. Very well. Miss Vale, you may present your statement, though I caution you that testimony given under these circumstances can be subject to charges of perjury should any claims prove false. The threat was clear: speak carefully or face criminal prosecution. Adrianne felt her pulse hammering but kept her voice steady. She'd practiced this testimony for 3 weeks, had refined every word, had prepared for every possible objection. She was as ready as she would ever be. Gentlemen, she began, I come before you not as a radical seeking to overturn social order, but as someone who has witnessed suffering that could be prevented with proper oversight and basic safety measures. On the night of April 15th, at the Hartwell Charity Ball, I publicly accused Duke Marcus Halbrook of negligence regarding working conditions on his estates. Those accusations were based on documented evidence of mine collapses, inadequate safety protocols, and systematic failure to maintain equipment that directly resulted in worker deaths. Accusations you made with considerable drama, Pemberton interrupted. Accusations that destroyed your own reputation and your family's social standing. Some might say you're motivated more by bitterness than concern for workers. Some might say that, Adrianne agreed calmly. They would be wrong. The evidence I presented was accurate. His Grace subsequently investigated personally and discovered that conditions were even worse than I'd claimed. He has since implemented comprehensive reforms across all his holdings, reforms that have demonstrably improved safety without significantly impacting profitability. She gestured to Marcus, who stood and presented the first set of documents. Detailed reports showing accident rates before and after reforms, financial records demonstrating that improved conditions had actually increased productivity, testimony from workers themselves describing the changes. The committee members examined the papers with varying degrees of interest and skepticism. These reforms were implemented voluntarily, one member noted. They don't necessarily indicate a need for legislative intervention. They were implemented after public pressure, Adrianne corrected. After scandal and investigation forced His Grace to confront conditions he'd been unaware of because his estate managers had actively concealed them. And they were nearly sabotaged by Lord Thornfield and others who believed maintaining aristocratic profits justified any amount of worker suffering. Lord Thornfield is currently facing serious charges, Pemberton said stiffly. Charges that remain unproven. Using his situation to support your argument is prejudicial. Then let me provide additional evidence. Nathan Calder stepped forward, carrying a leather case bulging with documents. I'm Nathan Calder, owner of Calder Steel Mills. For the past 6 months, my investigators have been examining industrial accidents across Britain. We've identified a pattern of preventable deaths and injuries occurring at facilities with inadequate safety protocols. These aren't isolated incidents. They represent systematic failure to prioritize worker welfare. He began presenting case after case, mine collapses that could have been prevented with proper timber supports, factory fires that spread because emergency exits were blocked or non-existent, machinery accidents that occurred because equipment wasn't properly maintained. Each case was documented with photographs, testimony, official reports that had been filed, and then ignored by authorities. The committee members grew progressively quieter as the evidence mounted. Even Pemberton's hostility seemed to waver in the face of such overwhelming documentation. This is quite extensive, Lord Hastings said finally. But surely some accidents are inevitable given the nature of industrial work. We cannot eliminate all risk. We're not asking you to eliminate all risk, Marcus replied. We're asking you to require basic safety measures that significantly reduce preventable deaths, proper ventilation in mines, emergency exits in factories, regular equipment maintenance, training for workers operating dangerous machinery. These measures exist. Some estates and mills already implement them. We're simply proposing that Parliament make them mandatory rather than optional. And who pays for these improvements? Another committee member demanded. Estate owners, factory operators? The costs could be substantial. Less substantial than the cost of replacing dead workers, Adrianne said flatly. Less than the cost to families who lose breadwinners. Less than the cost to society of maintaining a system where industrial progress is built on human suffering. But since we anticipated this concern, she nodded to Nathan, who presented another set of documents. We've prepared detailed cost analyses showing that these safety measures can be implemented without bankrupting estates or forcing factories to close. The hearing continued for hours. Question after question, objection after objection, the committee probed every aspect of their testimony. Some members were genuinely curious, asking thoughtful questions about implementation and enforcement. Others were openly hostile, searching for any inconsistency or exaggeration they could use to discredit the entire proposal. But the evidence was too thorough, too well documented, too irrefutable. In Marcus's presence, a duke voluntarily testifying about his own estate's failures, publicly supporting reforms that would cost him money, carried weight that no amount of radical advocacy could have achieved alone. As afternoon light began fading through the chamber windows, Pemberton finally called for a recess. This committee will deliberate on the testimony presented. We'll reconvene tomorrow to hear from estate managers and other interested parties. Miss Vale, Your Grace, you're dismissed. They filed out into the corridor, exhaustion hitting Adrianne like a physical wave. Her voice was hoarse from hours of testimony, her hands aching from where she'd gripped the podium, her entire body trembling with released tension. You were magnificent, Marcus said quietly, his hand finding hers despite the impropriety. Absolutely magnificent. Every question they threw at you. You had evidence. You had answers. You never wavered. We don't know if it worked, Adrianne cautioned. Pemberton clearly wants to dismiss everything we said. Pemberton is one voice among 12, Nathan pointed out, and I saw faces in there, peers who were genuinely troubled by the evidence. We moved them, Adrianne. Maybe not all of them, but enough to matter. Over the following days, the committee heard from other witnesses, estate managers who defended current practices, factory owners who claimed reforms would bankrupt them, even a few aristocrats who argued that worker safety was already adequate and legislation would be government overreach. But they also heard from doctors who'd treated industrial injuries, from clergy who'd buried workers killed in preventable accidents, from a few brave workers who testified about conditions despite fear of retaliation. And through it all, the newspapers covered every moment. The hearings became the story dominating British society. Debates raged in drawing rooms and pubs, in Parliament and on street corners. Some defended the aristocracy and industrial owners, arguing that interfering with private property rights would destroy British economic power. Others demanded reform, pointing to the mounting evidence of preventable suffering. The engagement announcement broke during the hearing's second week, and London society erupted exactly as the Dowager Duchess had predicted. A duke marrying the woman who'd publicly humiliated him months earlier? A peer choosing a merchant's daughter over appropriate aristocratic matches? The scandal was delicious, shocking, and dominated every social gathering. Duke Halbrook has lost his mind, Lady Pemberton declared at a tea Adrianne attended with the Dowager Catherine as chaperone. The invitation had been extended with obvious reluctance, social obligation overcoming personal disapproval. Marrying a woman who destroyed his reputation, who's made a spectacle of herself testifying before Parliament like some kind of political radical, it's unseemly. It's strategic, another woman countered, Mrs. Helena Ashford, who'd traveled from Bath specifically to support Adrianne. Miss Vale has proven herself remarkably effective at reform advocacy. The Duke recognizes that her passion combined with his position and resources could accomplish genuine change. That's partnership, not scandal. Partnership, Lady Pemberton sniffed. In my day, we called it something else when unmarried women spent weeks living in a gentleman's household. In your day, the Dowager Duchess said coldly, women were expected to be decorative and silent. Fortunately, times are changing. My son has chosen a woman of courage and principle rather than some vapid aristocrat whose only qualification is her pedigree. I consider that progress. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut. Adrianne sat quietly, letting the Dowager fight this particular battle, knowing her presence was causing discomfort that ranged from mild disapproval to active hostility. This was what marriage to Marcus would mean. Constant navigation of social situations where half the attendees considered her presence an insult to proper society. But it also meant this: the Dowager Duchess defending her publicly, Helena providing intellectual support, a few younger women watching with expressions that suggested they found the scandal more inspiring than appalling. Not everyone in British society believed the old order should remain unchanged forever. The parliamentary committee delivered its findings on a gray morning in late October. Adrianne sat in the gallery with Marcus, both dressed formally, both trying to hide their nervousness as Lord Pemberton rose to read the committee's conclusions. This committee has spent 3 weeks examining testimony and evidence regarding industrial working conditions in Britain, Pemberton began, his voice carefully neutral. We have heard from estate owners, factory operators, workers, medical professionals, and reform advocates. The testimony has been extensive and in some cases quite disturbing. He paused, and Adrianne felt her heart hammering. This was it, the moment that would determine whether months of work, scandal, and sacrifice had accomplished anything beyond personal notoriety. The committee finds, Pemberton continued, that while British industry has achieved remarkable economic success, this success has in some cases been accompanied by inadequate attention to worker safety and welfare. While we do not endorse the more extreme claims of radical reformers, we acknowledge that certain basic safety measures could be implemented without unreasonable burden to estate and factory owners. Adrianne felt Marcus's hand tighten on hers. This was more than she'd hoped for. Actual acknowledgement that problems existed, that reform might be necessary. Therefore, Pemberton said, his voice becoming more reluctant, this committee recommends that Parliament consider legislation establishing minimum safety standards for mines, factories, and industrial operations. Such legislation would require proper ventilation, adequate emergency exits, regular equipment maintenance, and basic training for workers operating dangerous machinery. Implementation would be phased to allow owners reasonable time to comply, and enforcement would be handled through existing magistrate systems. The gallery erupted. Workers' groups cheered, reformers applauded, conservative peers shouted objections. Pemberton hammered for order, his face red with frustration at the chaos. This is a recommendation only, he continued once quiet was restored. Parliament must still debate and vote on any proposed legislation, but this committee believes the evidence justifies careful consideration of reforms that balance industrial progress with basic human welfare. It wasn't everything. It wasn't comprehensive reform or radical transformation, but it was recognition, official parliamentary recognition that the system needed to change. That worker safety mattered. That aristocratic power came with responsibilities beyond profit maximization. Marcus pulled Adrianne to her feet as the gallery continued buzzing with reaction, as reporters scrambled to document the historic moment, as reformers and conservatives began the debates that would shape whatever legislation eventually emerged. "We did it," he said quietly, his voice rough with emotion. "We actually did it. The committee recommended reform. Parliament is going to debate legislation. We changed something, Adrianne. We actually changed something." "It's not enough," she replied, but she was smiling through sudden tears. "It's just a beginning. The legislation has to pass, then be implemented, then enforced. There's so much more work ahead. Then we'll do that work. Together." The engagement ball was scheduled for November 15th, exactly 6 months after the Hartwell Charity Ball, where everything had started. The symmetry was deliberate. Marcus's way of demonstrating that this wasn't some scandal he was trying to minimize, but a choice he was proud to celebrate. Adrianne spent the morning of the ball with her family, who'd traveled to London for the occasion. Her father looked older but less defeated than when she'd last seen him. Marcus had quietly ensured several contracts came his way, nothing that looked like charity, but enough to stabilize the business. Charlotte was radiant, excited about the wedding, and only slightly bitter about her own diminished prospects. "I'm proud of you," her mother said quietly, helping Adrianne into the gown that had been commissioned for the occasion, deep emerald silk that brought out her eyes, elegant without being ostentatious. "I don't always understand your choices, and I wish you'd found an easier path. But I'm proud of what you've accomplished. Even though I destroyed our social standing, even though you forced us all to decide what matters more, comfort and respectability, or principle and change." Mrs. Vale's hands were gentle as she arranged Adrianne's hair. "You chose principle. That took courage I'm not sure I possess. But watching you testify before Parliament, seeing you refuse to stay silent even when silence would have been safer, I realized my daughter is braver than I ever imagined." Tears stung Adrianne's eyes. "I couldn't have done it without you, any of you. Knowing you were still here, still supporting me even when I'd made your lives harder, that kept me going. Then let's go show London society that the Vales don't apologize for having a daughter with courage." Halbrook House blazed with light as evening descended, every window glowing. The grand ballroom transformed into something magical with flowers and candles and music that poured out into the street. Carriages lined up for blocks, London's elite arriving to witness what would undoubtedly be the most controversial engagement ball in recent memory. Adrianne descended the main staircase on her father's arm, acutely aware of every eye turning toward her, every whisper that followed her progress. This was different from the Hartwell ball. Then she'd been a minor figure, a merchant's daughter admitted on her family's limited social credit. Now she was the woman who'd challenged a duke, testified before Parliament, and somehow ended up engaged to one of Britain's most powerful peers. Marcus waited at the base of the stairs, magnificent in formal evening clothes, his eyes fixed on her with an expression that made her breath catch. When she reached him, he took her hand and raised it to his lips, a gesture both traditional and pointed, a public declaration of respect before everyone present. "You're stunning," he murmured. "Absolutely stunning. And I'm the luckiest man in Britain." "You're the most scandalous man in Britain," Adrianne corrected. "Half these people came just to witness the disaster of you actually going through with this engagement." "Then let's give them a show worth witnessing." The orchestra struck up a waltz. Marcus led Adrianne onto the dance floor, and for the first dance at their engagement ball, they were alone, every other guest standing back to watch, to judge, to assess whether this unlikely alliance would hold or crumble under social pressure. Adrianne had never been a natural dancer, but Marcus guided her effortlessly, his hand firm on her waist, his movements confident and assured. They circled the ballroom floor, and gradually other couples joined them, some supportive, some merely observing social obligation, but dancing nonetheless. "See," Marcus said quietly, "society adapts. Slowly, grudgingly, but it adapts. Some of them are only dancing because refusing would be too obvious an insult. I'll take grudging acceptance over open hostility. It's progress." The evening proceeded with all the formal rituals of an engagement ball, toasts and speeches, presentations of gifts, carefully choreographed social interactions designed to demonstrate family approval and social acceptance. Marcus's mother gave a speech praising Adrianne's courage and principle, pointedly noting that the Halbrook family valued character over pedigree. Nathan Calder spoke about reform and partnership and the importance of using privilege to serve rather than exploit. And then Lord Hastings rose, surprising everyone. "I must confess," he began, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent ballroom, "that 6 months ago I considered Duke Halbrook's alliance with Miss Vale to be at best misguided, at worst a betrayal of his class. I believe the accusations of negligence were exaggerated, that reform advocates were dangerous radicals seeking to overturn natural social order." Adrianne felt her stomach clench. This was going to be a public denunciation, a high-profile peer using their engagement ball to condemn everything they'd fought for. "But then," Hastings continued, "I actually investigated my own estates. I examined the mines, visited the tenant farms, spoke to workers rather than simply trusting my manager's reports. And what I found horrified me. Conditions I would never tolerate for animals being endured by human beings whose labor generates my family's wealth. Miss Vale was right. His Grace was right. We, the aristocracy, have been profoundly, criminally negligent." The ballroom was absolutely silent now, every person frozen in shock. "So I stand here tonight," Hastings said, raising his glass, "to toast not just this engagement but the partnership it represents. To Duke Halbrook and Miss Vale. May your marriage be long and happy, and may your example inspire others to recognize that power without responsibility is simply tyranny dressed in fine clothes. To courage, to principle, and to change that's long overdue." "To courage and change," other voices echoed, and suddenly half the ballroom was toasting them, glasses raised, and Adrianne felt tears streaming down her face because this was more than she'd imagined possible. Not universal acceptance, but genuine respect from people who'd been hostile months ago. Recognition that their fight had mattered, had changed minds, had accomplished something real. Marcus pulled her close, heedless of propriety, and kissed her forehead. "We did it," he whispered. "We actually did it." But the evening wasn't over. As the toast concluded and conversations resumed, a commotion erupted near the ballroom entrance. Adrianne turned to see Charlotte pushing through the crowd, her face flushed and urgent. "Adrianne, father, he's collapsed!" The ballroom spun as Adrianne ran, her elegant gown hampering her movement, her heart hammering with terror. She found her father on the floor of the entrance hall, his face gray, his breathing labored. Marcus was already kneeling beside him, having somehow gotten there first, his fingers on Thomas Vale's wrist checking for pulse. "Send for a doctor immediately," Marcus commanded a nearby footman, "and get him somewhere he can lie flat. The drawing room, quickly." They carried Thomas to the drawing room, Adrianne's mother weeping quietly, Charlotte's face white with shock. Dr. Morrison arrived within minutes. He'd been at the ball as a guest and came running the moment he heard. He examined Thomas quickly, his expression grave. "His heart," Morrison said quietly. "The strain has been too much. Has he been under significant stress recently?" "Yes," Adrianne whispered, guilt crushing her chest. "The business struggles, the social scandal, the constant worry about his family's reputation, all of it traceable back to her choices at the Hartwell Ball months ago. Because of me. This is my fault." "This is not your fault," her father rasped, his voice weak but determined. "Don't you dare take responsibility for an old man's failing heart." "Father, please don't talk." "Have to talk." Thomas reached for her hand with trembling fingers. "Have to tell you before I can't. I was angry for months, so angry at what you'd done. The scandal, the business problems, everything. But tonight, hearing Lord Hastings, watching these people toast your courage, seeing how you changed things." His voice broke. "I'm proud of you, Adrianne. More proud than I've ever been. You were braver than I ever taught you to be." "Father, let me finish. Your mother was right. I raised you to be obedient, respectable, safe. But you became something better. Someone who stands up when others stay silent, who fights for what's right even when it costs everything." He squeezed her hand weakly. "That's not my fault. That's who you chose to be, and I'm sorry I didn't see it sooner." Dr. Morrison intervened gently. "Mr. Vale needs rest, complete rest, minimal stress, careful monitoring. The next few days will be critical." They moved Thomas to a guest room in Halbrook House, Marcus insisting with a firmness that brooked no argument that the family would stay there until the crisis passed. The engagement ball continued below with muted celebration, guests understanding that something serious had occurred, but continuing out of social obligation. Adrianne sat by her father's bedside through the night, holding his hand, watching his labored breathing, praying to anything that might listen that he would survive. Marcus came and went quietly, bringing tea, reporting that the ball had concluded successfully, simply sitting beside her when words weren't needed. As dawn light began filtering through the windows, Thomas's breathing finally steadied, his color improving slightly. Dr. Morrison examined him again and nodded with cautious optimism. "He's stabilized. With proper rest and care, he should recover. Though he'll need to reduce stress significantly, no more managing the business day to day, at least for several months." "I'll handle that," Marcus said immediately. "I can arrange for experienced managers to take over operations, report to Mr. Vale without requiring his active involvement. And financially, no." Thomas's voice was stronger now, more alert. "No charity, Your Grace. I appreciate the offer, but the Vale Shipping Company will stand or fall on its own merits." "It's not charity, it's investment," Marcus corrected. "I need reliable shipping partners for materials from my northern estates. Your company has a good reputation and could be profitable with proper management and capital. I'm proposing a business arrangement, not a gift." Thomas studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "A business arrangement. Very well, though I suspect you're being generous about what constitutes fair terms." "I'm being strategic about securing reliable partners," Marcus replied, "which happens to also help my future father-in-law. Call it enlightened self-interest." Over the following weeks, as Thomas recovered and the parliamentary debates over safety legislation intensified, Adrianne and Marcus prepared for their wedding. It would be a grand affair. Marcus insisted on that, wanted to demonstrate that he was proud rather than embarrassed by his choice, that their marriage represented partnership rather than scandal. Society needs to see that this isn't some desperate attempt to salvage reputations, he explained as they reviewed wedding plans. It's a deliberate choice between equals. A duke and a reformer, yes, but more fundamentally, two people who've chosen each other despite every reason. It's complicated. "It is complicated," Adrianne agreed. "I'll be a duchess." "Me, the woman who was declared unfit to be anyone's wife 6 months ago. I'll have to navigate society events, manage a household staff, represent the Halbrook family at functions. I have no idea how to do any of that." "Then we'll figure it out together. Just like we figured out how to testify before Parliament, how to survive fires and betrayals, how to change a system that resisted transformation with everything it had. Compared to that, Society events should be manageable. You're remarkably optimistic for someone whose entire social circle considers him a traitor to his class. My entire former social circle, Marcus corrected. I've discovered I prefer the company of people who value principle over pedigree. Present company especially. The wedding was set for December 20th at St. George's Chapel. The guest list was a mixture of old aristocracy, those who'd accepted the match, or at least stopped actively opposing it, and the new allies they'd made through reform work. Workers' groups sent representatives, reform advocates attended in force, and several members of parliament who'd voted for the safety legislation came to demonstrate their support. The night before the wedding, Adrianne stood in her room at Halbrook House, looking at the white dress hanging ready for tomorrow. It was beautiful, simple but elegant, nothing ostentatious or designed to prove wealth. She'd insisted on that, wanted the wedding to reflect who they actually were, rather than performing for society's expectations. A knock at the door revealed Marcus, formally breaking the tradition about seeing the bride before the ceremony. "I know I'm not supposed to be here," he said, "but there's something I need to give you before tomorrow." He handed her a small velvet box. Inside was a ring, not the elaborate diamond engagement ring he'd presented publicly, but something simpler and more personal. A band of gold etched with words. "Neither restraint nor grace," Adrianne read aloud, recognizing the phrase he'd used to condemn her at the Hartwell ball. "You're giving me a ring inscribed with the words you used to humiliate me?" "Keep reading." She looked closer. On the inside of the band, more words. "But courage and conviction. The best choice I ever made was being proven wrong by you." Adrianne felt tears burning her eyes. "Marcus, I was wrong about everything that night," he said quietly. "Wrong about you. Wrong about what matters. Wrong about who deserves respect and power. You were right, devastatingly, uncomfortably right about everything. And instead of staying safely silent, you spoke up anyway. That courage changed my life, changed me. So yes, I'm giving you a ring inscribed with those words, because they represent the moment everything shifted. The moment I met someone who refused to accept that power exempts people from responsibility." "I was terrified that night," Adrianne admitted. "Absolutely terrified. I thought speaking up would change something, but I had no idea it would lead to all this. To reforms and parliamentary testimony, and somehow ending up engaged to you." "Regret it?" "Not even slightly. Though I reserve the right to regret it tomorrow when I'm standing in front of hundreds of people being judged as the merchant's daughter who trapped a duke." "You didn't trap me. You freed me from being someone I'm not proud of. That's worth any amount of society scandal." The wedding dawned cold and clear, winter sun streaming through St. George's Chapel windows. Adrianne walked down the aisle on her father's arm, Thomas still pale and moving carefully, but recovered enough to give away his daughter. The chapel was packed beyond capacity, people standing in the back, craning for a view of this unprecedented marriage. Marcus stood at the altar in formal dress, his face serious and solemn until she reached him. Then he smiled, genuine and warm and absolutely certain, and Adrianne felt her nervousness dissolve. This was right, complicated and unconventional and guaranteed to scandalize half of Britain, but absolutely right. The ceremony proceeded traditionally until the final vows, when Marcus made an unexpected choice. Instead of standing above Adrianne as convention dictated, as grooms always positioned themselves in aristocratic weddings to demonstrate authority and hierarchy, he knelt. Gasps rippled through the chapel. This wasn't how things were done. Grooms stood, brides knelt or remained standing lower. The positioning demonstrated social order, masculine authority, proper hierarchy between husband and wife. Marcus ignored every expectation. He knelt before Adrianne and took her hands in his, looking up at her with an expression of absolute devotion and respect. "I kneel before you," he said clearly, his voice carrying through the stunned silence, not as submission, but as recognition. "Recognition that you possess courage I'm still learning, conviction I'm trying to earn, and principles I aspire to match. You challenged me when everyone else deferred. You spoke truth when silence was safer. You forced me to become better than I was. So I kneel in respect for who you are, in gratitude for what you've taught me, and in promise that our marriage will be partnership between equals rather than hierarchy between ranks." Then he kissed her hand, Not a traditional gesture, but something more profound, more honest, more revolutionary than any words could express. The chapel erupted. Some guests cheered, others gasped in shock. Still others whispered scandalized commentary. But Adrianne barely heard any of it. She was looking at Marcus, this man who'd been so cold and arrogant at the Hartwell Ball, who'd learned to question his assumptions and change his priorities, who was now publicly declaring his respect in ways that defied centuries of aristocratic tradition. "You're going to be insufferable about this," she whispered, smiling through tears. "So proud of yourself for being progressive and romantic." "Absolutely insufferable," he agreed, "but also completely sincere. You're the best thing that ever happened to me, Adrianne. Even when you were destroying my reputation and forcing me to confront uncomfortable truths, especially then, you made me into someone I can actually respect." The bishop cleared his throat pointedly. "If you're quite finished with the dramatic gestures, Your Grace, we have a ceremony to complete." They finished the vows standing side by side, equals before clergy and witnesses, partners in marriage and life, and the work still ahead. When the bishop pronounced them married, Marcus kissed her properly, thoroughly, with complete disregard for propriety or aristocratic restraint. "Lady Halbrook," he murmured against her lips. "The Duchess of Halbrook. How does it feel?" "Terrifying," Adrianne admitted. "Wonderful, like something I'll spend the rest of my life trying to live up to." "Then we'll spend that time together, reforming estates, fighting for legislation, probably scandalizing society on a regular basis. Partners in everything." The reception at Halbrook House was magnificent. Music and dancing, toasts and celebration, society figures mixing with workers' advocates and reform groups in ways that would have been unthinkable a year ago. Lord Hastings gave a speech about the importance of using privilege responsibly. Nathan Calder spoke about partnership and progress. The Dowager Duchess wept openly, declaring it the finest wedding she'd ever attended. And late in the evening, when the formal celebrations had wound down and most guests had departed, Adrianne stood with Marcus on the terrace overlooking London. The city sprawled before them, millions of lives being lived, workers and aristocrats and everyone between, all navigating a society that was slowly, grudgingly beginning to change. "It's not enough," Adrianne said quietly. "The parliamentary legislation, the reforms we've implemented. It's progress, but it's not enough. There's so much more work to do." "Then we'll do it," Marcus replied, his arm around her waist. "We'll keep pushing for better conditions, stronger legislation, actual enforcement. We'll use every ounce of influence and resources we have. And we'll do it together, as partners who actually give a damn about more than maintaining our own comfort. Some people will never accept us. Never accept that a duke and a merchant's daughter can genuinely work together as equals. Some people are wrong, and their opinions matter less than the lives we can actually improve." They stood in comfortable silence, watching London's lights flicker in the winter darkness. Somewhere in that city, miners were descending into shafts that were incrementally safer because of regulations they'd fought for. Factory workers were going home at reasonable hours because of legislation they'd helped pass. Families weren't being evicted from tenant cottages for complaining about conditions because estate owners now faced oversight and consequences. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough until every worker had real safety, real recourse, real power to demand better treatment. But it was progress. Measurable, documented progress that Adrianne had helped create by refusing to stay silent that night at the Hartwell Ball. "Do you ever think about that night?" Marcus asked, reading her thoughts as he increasingly seemed able to do. "About what would have happened if you hadn't confronted me, if you'd stayed quiet like everyone expected?" "All the time," Adrianne admitted. "I think about how I had no idea what I was starting, how terrified I was, how certain I felt that I'd destroyed everything for nothing. And now? Now I know that sometimes you have to destroy everything to build something better, that speaking truth is worth the cost, even when the cost is enormous, that one person refusing to stay silent can actually change things if they're brave enough and strategic enough and lucky enough to find the right allies." Marcus turned her to face him, his hands gentle on her shoulders. "You changed everything, Adrianne, not just for workers or reform movements or parliamentary legislation. You changed me, fundamentally, irrevocably changed who I am and what I believe I should be. That's worth more than any amount of social acceptance or aristocratic approval. Even when your former friends cross the street to avoid speaking to you? Especially then, because it means I've chosen actual principles over comfortable complicity, that I'm becoming someone worth being married to. You were always worth it, Adrianne said softly. Even when you were arrogant and cold and absolutely certain of your own righteousness. You had the capacity to change. Most people don't. You just needed someone to force you to confront truths you'd been avoiding. I needed you to force me. Nobody else could have done it. They kissed as the city lights flickered below, as London society continued its endless dance of scandal and propriety, as somewhere in the darkness, workers were living incrementally better lives because two people had refused to accept that the system couldn't change. The woman who'd been called unfit to be a wife had become the Duchess of Halbrook, not by submission or by conforming to expectations, but by forcing society itself to transform. Not by staying silent, but by speaking so loudly that eventually, inevitably, people had to listen. And the man who'd once dismissed her as a naive fool had knelt before her in a chapel full of witnesses, declaring publicly that courage and conviction mattered more than rank or privilege or centuries of aristocratic tradition. It wasn't the ending anyone had expected that night at the Hartwell charity ball. It was better, messier, more complicated, more honest, and infinitely more hopeful. It was, Adrianne thought as Marcus pulled her closer, exactly the kind of ending you earned by refusing to accept the world as it was and fighting to make it what it should be. The kind you built one brave choice at a time.